Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The city shimmers beneath my window like a sea of artificial stars, but I've long since stopped finding comfort in the view. What captures my attention now is the adjacent building, specifically the balcony directly across from mine on the 12th floor. It's where he appears always at 3:14 a.m., always with the same routine, a skeletal figure in an outdated bowler hat. His emaciated frame barely substantial enough to support his vintage three-piece suit. The cherry of his cigar glows unnaturally bright against the darkness like a malevolent eye. Watching me through the night, I've come to dread the moment when that first wisp of smoke begins its impossible journey across the 30-foot gap separating our buildings. I'm a furniture restorer by trade. My apartment doubles as my workshop with my living room. Dominated by the pieces I'm currently bringing back to life, the smell of lacquer, varnish, and wood polish has long since permeated every fabric in my home. My fingers perpetually bear the tiny cuts and calluses of my craft. I take pride in my work. There's something deeply satisfying about rescuing a neglected antique, stripping away decades of abuse, and revealing the craftsmanship beneath. At least, that's how I felt before. The smoking man appeared. It started 3 months ago. I was working late on an ornate Victorian writing desk, a challenging piece with intricate inlay work that required meticulous attention. Sleep had become elusive, so I'd taken to working through the night. The repetitive motions of sanding and polishing had a meditative quality that calmed my racing thoughts. I remember glancing up around 3 in the morning, my eyes drawn to movement across the void. That's when I first saw him. He stood perfectly still on the neighboring balcony, smoke curling from his cigar in defiance of the wind that typically howls between our buildings. At that height, I initially thought nothing of it, just another insomniac seeking solace in nicotine and night air. But then the smoke began to move with purpose, coalescing into a sinuous tendril that stretched improbably toward my open window. My skin prickled with goosebumps as I watched the impossible physics unfold before me. The smoke entered my workspace, hovering above the desk I was restoring. To my astonishment, it formed itself into the unmistakable shape of a hand, its finger extending to point at a section of veneer I had repaired earlier that evening. I peered closer, my heart hammering against my ribs. There, barely visible to the naked eye, was a misalignment in the grain pattern, a flaw so subtle only a master craftsman would notice, or whatever this entity was that night. I corrected the imperfection, working with trembling hands under the watchful gaze of the smoking man. When I finished, the smoke hand formed a gesture of approval, a thumbs up so human in its execution that a hysterical laugh escaped my throat. The man tipped his hat in acknowledgement, the cherry of his cigar flaring briefly before he turned and walked back into his apartment. This became our nightly ritual. I would work. He would appear. The smoke would identify flaws invisible to my eye. I would correct them. My pieces began selling for higher prices, clients marveling at the perfection of my restorations. I should have been grateful. Instead, I felt increasingly uneasy about my spectral quality. Inspector Sleep became fractured. My days hazy with exhaustion, I found myself jumping at shadows and flinching at the smell of tobacco. My research into the neighboring building yielded nothing unusual, just another luxury high-rise with no reported strange occurrences. I asked my neighbor across the hall if she'd noticed anything unusual about the building across from us. She looked at me strangely, mentioning that the 12th floor of that particular building had always been mechanical space. No apartments, no balconies, just a blank facade housing the building's HVAC system. I dismissed her statement as confusion, pointing out the window to show her the balcony, but when we looked together there was nothing there, just a sheer wall of glass and concrete. She suggested not unkindly that perhaps I needed more sleep. I nodded absently but knew what I'd seen. What I continued to see every night as weeks passed, the smoking man grew more demanding. The smoke hands became more assertive, sometimes slapping away my tools. If I made an approach they disapproved of, my work improved beyond my own understanding. In incorporating techniques I'd never learned. Each finished piece carried an unsettling perfection that didn't feel entirely mine last week. The smoke began to linger longer after each correction, drifting through my living space. Exploring, I'd wake from brief naps to find it hovering near my family, photographs, or examining my personal collection of antique woodworking tools. My grandfather's hand plane, a cherished heirloom, vibrated slightly whenever the smoke passed over it. The temperature in my apartment dropped precipitously during these visitations, my breath frosting in the air. Despite the summer heat outside, I began taking sleeping pills, desperate to break the 3:14 a.m. cycle. They didn't work. No matter how heavily sedated, I would snap awake at exactly the same time. Drawn to the window by an inexorable force, the smoking man would already be there, waiting, watching, his hollow eyes reflecting nothing. Yesterday, I resolved to end this bizarre relationship when the smoke hand formed and pointed to a minor flaw in the Chip and Dale chair I was restoring. I deliberately turned away, focusing instead on another section that needed no correction. My defiance hung in the air between us, a tangible thing. The smoke froze mid-gesture, then withdrew slightly, as if in surprise. A low rattling sound carried across the gap between our buildings. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cough, but something ancient and dry like pages of forgotten books. Turning in an abandoned library, the smoking man took a long, deliberate draw on his cigar, his sunken cheeks hollowing further with the effort. The cherry flared with unnatural brightness, casting his skeletal face in demonic relief. What happened next still makes my hands shake too badly to hold my restoration tools. The smoke didn't form a hand. It poured through my window in a continuous, purposeful stream, far more than could possibly come from a single cigar. It filled my living room like an invading fog, dense and acrid, carrying the scent not just of tobacco, but of something older. Burning wood, scorched varnish, and beneath it all the unmistakable metallic tang of blood. The smoke condensed, solidifying into three distinct figures, perfect replicas of the smoking man, each as gaunt and antiquated as the original, who still watched him passively. From what I believed was the neighboring balcony, these smoke constructs moved with jerking, unnatural motions, circling my workbench with the mechanical precision of automata. Their feet made no sound on my hardwood floor, but when their knuckles rapped against the chair I'd been restoring, the impacts were devastatingly physical. Tap, tap, tap. With each knock, the wood splintered, cracks racing through the centuries-old mahogany like lightning. I watched in horror as months of painstaking restoration work was systematically destroyed. My throat closed around a scream that wouldn't come. My limbs felt lead, immobilized by terror so profound it had short-circuited my flight response. The three figures worked in perfect synchronization, moving from the chair to other pieces in my workshop. Each tap brought destruction. Each piece of furniture suffering precisely the same damage, splintering along the grain in patterns that formed symbols I almost recognized but couldn't quite comprehend. My rational mind struggled to process what I was seeing, clinging desperately to explanations involving hallucinations or carbon monoxide poisoning. Only when they approached my grandfather's workbench did something in me snap. I lunged forward with a hoarse cry, swinging wildly at the nearest figure. My hands passed through it like it was made of nothing more substantial than the smoke that formed it. But my movement seemed to disrupt whatever force animated them. They paused, three identical faces turning toward me with expressions of mild surprise. In that moment of confusion, I staggered to the window, desperate to confront the original smoking man. What I saw, or rather didn't see, turned my blood to ice water. There was no balcony, no apartment, just a blank wall of tinted glass reflecting the lights of the city, and my own pale, terrified face. I collapsed against the windowsill, my perception of reality unraveling like cheap thread behind me. The three figures had resumed their destruction, methodically tapping every piece of furniture in my collection. I closed my eyes, repeating to myself that none of this was real, that I was having some kind of breakdown, that I would wake up soon in a hospital with doctors explaining the psychological strain of working too hard, sleeping too little. A gentle pressure on my shoulder forced my eyes open. One of the smokemen stood before me, its face inches from mine. This close, I could see that what I had taken for eyes were actually empty sockets, bottomless and ancient. It extended a hand toward me, offering something my grandfather's plane, the wood now carved with the same symbols that decorated my ruined furniture. The smoke creature pressed the tool into my hands, its touch surprisingly warm and solid. As my fingers closed around the familiar handle, images flooded my mind. Workshops throughout history, craftsmen laboring under the watchful eyes of the smoking man, each producing work of impossible perfection, each eventually facing the same choice I now confronted. I understood. Then this was a test, a covenant, an initiation that was. Last night I haven't slept. Instead, I've spent the hours restoring the damaged furniture, working with a precision and insight that doesn't feel entirely my own. My fingers move with newfound knowledge, implementing techniques that died with master craftsmen centuries ago. The symbols I'm carving into the wood seem to shimmer with subtle power in the morning light. It's almost 300 p.m. now, 12 hours until he appears again. 12 hours to decide whether to accept this dark apprenticeship or to flee this apartment and never touch woodworking tools again. My grandfather's plane sits beside me, the symbols on its handle pulsing faintly in time. With my heartbeat, I can almost hear it whispering, promising secrets of craftsmanship beyond mortal understanding. If only I'm willing to pay the price. Whatever I decide, I know one thing with absolute certainty. Perfection demands sacrifice, and the smoking man and his cigar will be waiting at 3:14 a.m., whether I have a balcony for him to stand on or not. Story 2, cold sweat trickled down my spine the moment I stepped into my grandfather's house. Even in daylight, the century-old Victorian felt wrong, like the walls themselves were watching me, measuring my worth. With the silent judgment of generations past, the wood floors creaked under my weight. Not the familiar welcome groan of settled timber, but the deliberate complaint of something disturbed from slumber. I told myself these were the normal sounds of an old house, that the shadows stretching longer than they should were just tricks of light through warped windows. I was wrong. I'd purchased the property from my distant relatives who wanted nothing to do with Grandfather Malcolm's estate. After his passing, they practically gave it away, mentioning something about the old man's obsession with his craft. Malcolm Redfield had been a master woodworker, creating pieces that museums now displayed behind glass. His reputation for perfectionism was legendary. He'd once burned an entire dining set because one chair leg was a quarter-inch too short. Nobody would have noticed he did. The house came with his workshop in the basement and years of accumulated tools. The inheritance was perfect for me. I'd been running my small furniture restoration business from a cramped garage, and this space offered room to expand. I'd grown up hearing stories about grandfather's exceptional skill. Though I'd only met him once as a child, I remembered him as a tall, severe man with hands like gnarled oak and eyes that seemed to measure everything they fell upon. The first 3 days were consumed with cleaning and organizing. I swept away decades of dust, arranged my tools alongside his, and set up my workbench beneath the high basement windows. By late afternoon on the fourth day, I prepared the space for my first project, restoring an antique writing desk for a client in Boston. I worked until darkness fell, losing myself in the familiar rhythms of sanding and scraping. It was nearly midnight when I finally switched off the basement lights and climbed the stairs to the second floor where I'd set up my bedroom. Exhaustion weighed on my limbs, but satisfaction coursed through me. Tomorrow I would begin applying the first coats of varnish. That night marked the beginning. I was drifting towards sleep when a floorboard creaked in the hallway. My eyes snapped open, heart instantly hammering the sound. Came again deliberate footsteps moving with slow, methodical purpose. I lay paralyzed, my throat constricting as I watched the gap beneath my door. A shadow passed, too tall, too narrow to be anything human, blocking the faint moonlight from the hallway window. Then another and another. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As sweat soaked my sheets, the temperature in the room plummeted, my exhaled breath suddenly visible in pale clouds. Through the wall, I heard something being dragged across the floor of the adjacent room, followed by faint scratching sounds like sandpaper on wood. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was a dream sleep deprivation combined with the stress of the move, a reasonable explanation. I laughed at my midnight fears while brewing coffee, though the laughter died when I noticed fresh sawdust on the kitchen floor that I hadn't tracked in that evening. I installed motion sensor cameras throughout the house, one in the hallway, one at the top of the basement stairs, another in the workshop itself. Technology would provide rational answers where imagination had supplied supernatural ones. I worked late again, meticulously applying the first coat of varnish to the writing desk. The smell filled the basement with its sharp chemical tang, mixing with the older sense of wood and metal. I must have dozed off at my workbench because I jerked awake at 2:17 a.m. According to my watch, something had disturbed me, a noise from upstairs. Rising from my stool muscles, stiff and aching, I moved toward the basement stairs. The motion-activated light should have clicked on, but the stairwell remained dark. I fumbled for my phone, activating its flashlight. The beam caught something moving at the top of the stairs, a tall figure that retreated into the darkness too quickly for me to make out details. Just the impression of height and unnatural thinness remained. "Who's there?" My voice sounded thin and frightened, echoing off the stone walls. No response came, but through the cracks in the floorboards above, I saw dancing lights moving through the house, warm yellow glows like old lanterns being carried from room to room. I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, my flight response screaming to flee, while my rational mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Eventually, I forced myself to climb the stairs, each step requiring conscious effort. The house was empty, dark, and silent when I emerged. No lanterns, no figures, just the persistent feeling of being observed. I checked the cameras the next morning, hands shaking as I connected my laptop. The first two showed nothing. The hallway remained empty all night, the basement stairs undisturbed, but the workshop camera had triggered 3 times with growing dread. I clicked on the first video file, my own face filled. The screen eyes rolled back, showing only White's mouth slightly open, breathing in labored gasps. The camera angle was wrong, as if I were holding at myself. Pointed at my face from below, the timestamp showed 2:23 a.m. I watched in horror as my recorded self stared sightlessly for 30 seconds before the video ended. The second clip, timestamped 3:15 a.m., showed the same impossible image. My face, but not my face. Something wearing my features like an ill-fitting mask. The breathing was different now, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone sawing through hardwood. The third clip I couldn't finish. My face appeared closer to the lens, mouth stretched in a smile. No human mouth should make eyes, still rolled back. A thin, darkly stained hand, not mine, reached from behind my head and slowly covered the lens. I sat back, stomach churning with nausea, sweat beading on my forehead. Despite the morning chill, the cameras were supposed to provide answers. Not deep in the mystery, I moved through the day in a fog, unable to focus on my work. The writing desk sat half-varnished, forgotten. That afternoon, I noticed the smell. Fresh varnish, but stronger than what I'd applied to the desk. And coming from upstairs, following the scent, led me to the narrow door at the end of the hallway. The attic entrance, I hadn't been up there yet, assuming it contained only the previous owner's discarded belongings. The smell grew stronger as I approached the door. My hand trembled as it reached for the knob. My lungs struggling to draw breath. I told myself I was being irrational, that there would be a logical explanation. Perhaps an uncapped can of product from my grandfather's days, finally disturbed by the vibrations of my work. Downstairs, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not then. Instead, I went back to the basement, threw myself into work, and tried to ignore the growing sensation of eyes on my back. I made mistakes I never would have tolerated before, uneven sanding varnish applied too thickly, but I couldn't focus. My grandfather's tools hung on the wall. Watching the chisels, planes, and saws arranged in perfect order seemed to judge my inferior craftsmanship. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the house, settling around 3 a.m. The power went out. The darkness fell like a shroud, immediate and absolute. I fumbled for my phone, heart threatening to burst from my chest. They came then, tall figures moving through the darkness, their forms barely distinguishable from the shadows. Except for their unnatural height and thinness, I caught glimpses as they passed. The windows, elongated silhouettes backlit by moonlight carrying what looked like old-fashioned woodworking tools. The air filled with whispers too faint to make out, but carrying tones of disappointment. I remained frozen in place until dawn broke when the figures receded with the darkness. The power returned as suddenly as it had failed, lamps blazing back to life and momentarily blinding me. I spent the morning in town at a cafe using their Wi-Fi to research the house's history. Local news archives revealed what my relatives hadn't told me. My grandfather hadn't died peacefully in his sleep, as I'd been led to believe Malcolm Redfield had been found in his workshop, slumped over an unfinished piece. The coroner ruled natural causes, but locals whispered about the old man's obsession with perfection and the rumored apprentices who had lived with him over the years. Thin young men who arrived eager to learn from the master and left broken by his exacting standards. Some hadn't left at all. The rumor suggested I return to the house in the afternoon, determined to confront whatever waited in the attic. The smell of varnish was overwhelming now, seeping from under the attic door and filling the entire second floor. My mouth went dry as I approached legs threatening to buckle beneath me. The knob turned easily in my hand, the door swinging open on silent hinges. Dust motes danced in beams of sunlight. Filtering through small windows, the attic stretched longer than seemed possible, filled with sheet-covered furniture and stacked wooden crates. The floorboards were thick with dust, undisturbed except for a perfect circle of boot prints surrounding my toolbox which sat in the center of the room. Though I'd never brought it up here, the prints were deeply pressed into the dust, as if made by men standing in place for hours, looking down at my tools, judging them. Finding them wanting the circle was precise, methodical, a ritual of evaluation. I approached slowly, my breath shallow in the hot varnish. Heavy air, the toolbox was open. My implements arranged with a precision I never used. Each chisel saw and plane positioned according to size and function, but they weren't alone. Among them lay older tools, antiques with dark wooden handles polished by decades of use, their metal surfaces gleaming despite their age. My grandfather's personal set, which I'd never found among his possessions, a leather-bound journal, sat atop the arrangement. I hadn't seen it before, hadn't brought it up here with trembling fingers. I opened the cover to find my grandfather's tight, angular script filling the pages. The entries spanned decades, detailing his pursuit of woodworking perfection. In the early pages, his writing was measured and instructional, but grew increasingly obsessive. Through the years, the final entry, dated just before his death, sent ice through my veins. They watch me work. They have always watched. I've tried to meet their standards for 60 years. The Guild accepts only perfection, and perfection cannot be achieved by mortal hands alone. They offer guidance to those worthy of their attention. I have been found wanting. Perhaps my grandson will do better. The tools will pass to him, the Guild will be watching. As I read those final words, I felt their presence behind me. Tall, impossibly thin figures in outdated clothing smelling of sawdust and varnish. I didn't need to turn to know they were there, standing in their circle, waiting to evaluate my work, my worthiness. I understood then my grandfather hadn't been insane. The Guild was real. Ancient craftsmen who'd transcended mortality through their devotion to perfect woodworking, continuing to judge those who followed in their craft. They'd evaluated my grandfather for decades and found him lacking. Now they would judge me. I haven't left the house. I can't. The Guild watches me work each night. Their silent presence both terrifying and instructive. They move my tools when I'm not looking, adjust my measurements, leave examples of joinery so perfect it brings tears to my eyes. Sometimes I find my own hands moving in ways I never learned, guided by unseen forces toward greater precision. The cameras still record, only my face eyes. Vacant mouth moving to speak words. I don't remember. I've stopped checking the footage. My work is improving. The writing desk is finished, more beautiful than anything I've created before. I've started on a rocking chair now, using techniques I somehow know, but never studied. Sometimes in the mirror I notice my face changing, growing G, my fingers lengthening at night. I stand straighter, taller. I find myself moving through the house carrying an antique lantern I don't remember acquiring, inspecting the woodwork with critical eyes. I understand now why my grandfather never left, why he pushed himself toward impossible standards of craftsmanship. The guild demands perfection, and they have eternity to wait for it. I wonder sometimes how many others they've recruited through the centuries, how many workshops they haunt with their exacting standards. I wonder too how long before I join their circle permanently, before I become one of the tall figures judging the next generation of woodworkers through the endless night. I'm not afraid anymore, just determined to create something perfect to earn my place in the guild. After all, it's in my blood story. 3. The whispering began in the wires. 3 months ago, it found me through forgotten circuitry, copper veins carrying voices from somewhere that isn't quite here. I know now that the phones were never just collector's items. They were waiting patient sentinels until the right frequency found them, until it found me. My name is Robert James Caldwell. Nobody has called me that since my birth certificate was filed away decades ago. I go by Rob. Just Rob, the voice knows better. The basement hums with the soft electrical murmur of my collection. 37 rotary phones from the 1960s, meticulously restored and mounted on a custom panel I built against the far wall. Black bakelite, cream plastic avocado, green harvest gold, cherry red, each one salvaged from estate sales, antique shops and forgotten storage units across 3 states. My obsession began innocently enough. After inheriting my grandfather's Western Electric model, the solid weight of the receiver, the satisfying mechanical resistance of the rotary dial, tangible connections to a simpler analog era, I've always been particular about my workspace. The phones are arranged chronologically by manufacturer date, each one wired to a central junction box of my own design. It's unnecessary. Really, none of them should actually function as telephones. In any meaningful sense, the connections are purely aesthetic, a nod to authenticity that pleases my sense of order. The electrical work is minimal, just enough to power the small bulbs I've installed in some models to illuminate their translucent dials. The first call came at exactly 3:33 a.m. I know because I was there half asleep in my workshop chair finishing the restoration of a 1963 Northern Electric. The harsh mechanical ring shattered the silence like breaking glass. Not the cheerful, nostalgic bell ring you might imagine, but a strident, urgent alarm that raised the hair on my neck. My hand jerked, sending a small screwdriver clattering across the cement floor. 7 phones rang simultaneously, their bells synchronized in perfect, impossible harmony. I stood frozen, watching as they continued to ring my mind. Racing through explanations, of power surge, crossed wires, some elaborate malfunction. None made sense. These phones weren't connected to any active line, they couldn't ring. Yet they did when I finally lifted the receiver of the centermost phone. A black Western Electric 500 model static washed over me like cold water. The crackling white noise seemed to contain patterns just beyond comprehension, like hearing a conversation underwater. Then it resolved into a voice deep and resonant, yet somehow hollow, as if speaking from the bottom of a well. Robert James Caldwell. It said my full legal name, rolling from invisible lips with disturbing precision. You will mark your presence. Dial 33. My throat constricted, blood pulsing in my temples. Nobody calls me Robert James. Nobody. I slammed the receiver down, my hand trembling uncontrollably, sweat beading cold at my hairline. Sleep was impossible that night. I paced the main floor of my house, checking locks, peering through windows into the impenetrable darkness beyond. Rationality suggested a prank, an elaborate hoax, but something deeper. Some primitive instinct knew better when dawn finally broke. I convinced myself I dreamed the entire episode a hallucination born from too many late nights and too much solitude, until I walked into my kitchen and found every piece of silverware twisted into impossible corkscrew shapes. Metal warped as if it had melted and reformed, forks, spoons, knives all contorted into useless helical sculptures. I stood among the ruined cutlery, my heart hammering against my ribs, the taste of copper flooding my mouth. That was just the beginning. The next night, I disconnected every phone, unplugging my creations and removing the small bulbs that illuminated their dials. I even shut off the circuit breaker to the entire basement at precisely 3:33 a.m. I was awake watching the digital clock by my bedside, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. The distant ring echoed up through the floorboards, a muffled but unmistakable summons from below in the basement, illuminated only by my flashlight's narrow beam. 7 phones rang in unison, the same 7 as before. No power, no connections, not even complete internal mechanisms in some cases. Yet they rang with insistent mechanical voices. My flashlight flickered, dimmed, and died as I approached the wall of phones. In the perfect darkness, the ringing seemed to take physical form, vibrating through my bones. I fumbled for the receiver, my fingertips numb with dread. The same static, the same voice, the same command dial 33. This time I hung up immediately. My hand shook so violently I dropped the flashlight. Hearing it roll away across the concrete floor, I fled upstairs, locking the basement door behind me, pressing my back against it as if to hold something at bay. Sleep came eventually, just before dawn, a fitful collapse into unconsciousness rather than true rest. Morning revealed every mirror in my house had developed spiderweb cracks radiating outward from central points like frozen explosions. I threw away all my twisted silverware, bought new cutlery, and spent the day researching electromagnetic phenomena, pirate radio signals, and even the previous owners of my century-old house. I found nothing useful. Only ghost stories and pseudoscience. That night I took more drastic measures. I shut off the main power to the entire house and sat in my darkened living room, a baseball bat across my knees, eyes fixed on the basement door. My watch, an analog Timex that had belonged to my father, ticked steadily toward 3:33 a.m. My mouth was desert dry, my shirt damp with cold sweat. Despite the cool air at the appointed moment, silence held 1 minute past 2. I began to relax, exhaling a breath I hadn't realized I was holding then, a single. Phone rang not from the basement, but from upstairs in my bedroom, a phone that shouldn't exist. I took the stairs 2 at a time, bat clutched white-knuckled in my trembling hand. There on my nightstand sat a rotary phone I'd never seen before, an antique cream-colored model, its curly cords snaking into the darkness beneath my bed. It rang with authority, each bell strike seeming to vibrate the very air. The rational part of my mind shut down completely. I answered it. Robert James Caldwell. The voice began familiar now in its otherworldly resonance. Your resistance is noted and rejected. Dial 33, I hung up without speaking and spent the night in my car parked under the bright lights of a 24-hour supermarket. My breath fogging the windows as I watched the sun rise through bloodshot eyes. My new silverware greeted me, twisted into DNA like helices on the kitchen counter. Over the next few weeks, I tried everything. I stayed at hotels. The phones found me appearing in rooms that had only key cards for entry. I visited friends making excuses about home renovations, their silverware twisted overnight, their mirrors cracked. I consulted electricians, paranormal researchers, even a priest. No one could help. Most thought I was suffering delusions. I destroyed my collection, smashing each phone methodically with a hammer, burning the remains in a bonfire behind my house that drew concerned looks from neighbors that night in a sterile hotel room. 40 meters from home, a black rotary phone appeared on the desk while I showered. I answered it and hung up immediately in the morning. The hotel manager pounded on my door, demanding I pay for the destruction of property. Every piece of metal in the room, from the shower curtain rod to the bed frame, had warped and twisted overnight. Eventually, I gave in, standing before my reconstructed phone panel because somehow, impossibly, every phone had reappeared fully restored. I lifted the receiver of the Western Electric 500 at precisely 3:33 a.m. The voice instructed me to dial 33 with a shaking finger. I rotated the dial to 3, released it. Then again, the line went dead. Nothing happened. I slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks. No silverware twisted, no mirrors cracked for 3 days. I complied with the nightly ritual, answering at 3:33 a.m., dialing 33 and being rewarded with blessed normalcy. During daylight hours on the 4th night, the voice changed its message. Robert James Caldwell, satisfactory compliance phase. 2 initiated before I could respond. A sound filled the receiver, a wet, rhythmic pulsing that took several seconds to identify my own heartbeat, amplified and broadcast back to me, each valve and chamber squatching obscenely in my ear beneath it. Almost subliminal, the voice whispered, "Today we will synchronize your bones to the signal." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. The receiver dangled by its cord, the heartbeat sound growing louder until it seemed to fill the room, matching pace with my own racing pulse. Each beat reverberated through the basement, vibrating through the concrete floor into the soles of my feet. For hours I huddled in the corner, furthest from the phones, hands pressed uselessly over my ears, feeling the sound in my teeth and my joints behind my eyes. Just before dawn, it stopped. Silence crashed over me like a physical wave. When I finally dared to approach the panel, the receiver had returned to its cradle. Though I hadn't touched it, I didn't wait to see what new horrors morning would bring. I packed a bag and drove, putting miles between myself and that house, that basement. Those phones I drove until my vision blurred, stopping only when absolute exhaustion demanded it at a remote roadside motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Room 17 smelled of old cigarettes and chemical air freshener. I collapsed onto the bed without undressing. Sleep claiming me instantly, dreams came of wires growing beneath my skin, of rotary dials replacing my eyes, of a vast switchboard where each connection controlled the movement of my limbs. I woke to a familiar sound. The bedside lamp illuminated a green rotary phone I hadn't noticed earlier. The clock on the nightstand read 3:33 a.m. I answered without hesitation, surrender making my movements fluid despite my terror. Phase 2 progressing, the voice informed me bone conductivity at 30% remained still for calibration. A humming began not in the receiver but in my skull, a vibration that started at the base of my spine and traveled upward, vertebra by vertebra until it reached the base of my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely breathe as the vibration spread through my ribs, my shoulders, down my arms to my fingertips. I felt them then, microscopic adjustments in my skeletal structure, tiny realignments of cartilage and bone. Not painful exactly, but deeply wrong, like feeling your organs shift position. The voice continued speaking, but not through the phone. It resonated directly inside my head, transmitted through bone rather than air. Synchronization proceeding as expected. You are an excellent conductor, Robert James Caldwell. Your signal fidelity exceeds all previous subjects. The words triggered a cascade of images, other collectors, other basements, other phones, dozens, perhaps hundreds of them across the country, each experiencing their own version of my nightmare, all connected now through whatever was happening to our bodies. Our bones becoming receivers for something seeking entry. The vibrations intensified, concentrating in my jawbone. My teeth, the delicate structures of my inner ear. My body was becoming an antenna precisely tuned to receive a broadcast from somewhere impossibly distant. Not from any earthly source, I realized with sudden horrifying clarity, but from somewhere beyond conventional space, a dimension adjacent to our own, separated by a membrane growing thinner with each calibration. When dawn broke, I drove again, though I knew now it was futile. Distance meant nothing to what had found me. The phones were merely its first method of contact. Now it had more direct access that night in another anonymous motel room. No physical phone appeared. It didn't need one anymore. At precisely 3:33 a.m., I heard the ringing inside my skull, felt my jaw vibrating with the sound. I answered the only way I could now, by thinking the word hello, final synchronization commencing. The voice replied clear as crystal, though no sound disturbed the air. Your physical form is now an adequate vessel for transmission. The vibration this time began in my hands, a trembling. I couldn't control my fingers, curled into impossible positions, joints bending backward, tendons straining. My right index finger extended rigidly, then began moving in a circular motion, tracing the path of a rotary dial that wasn't there. 3 full rotations, then 3 more. 3-3 connection established. I felt it. Then the presence on the other end of this impossible communication. Not a single entity, but a collective vast and ancient waiting patiently across a gulf. My mind couldn't comprehend they had been reaching out for decades using the old copper networks, the physical switchboards, the mechanical devices we'd abandoned for digital convenience. Our technological progress had severed connections they'd spent generations establishing through analog means until people like me, collectors and restorers, provided new gateways. My body is no longer entirely my own during daylight hours. I maintain the appearance of normally, though people sometimes notice when my movements stutter briefly, when my speech patterns momentarily adopt unusual cadences at night. I surrender control my bones vibrating with transmissions I cannot consciously interpret. I've learned to live with it. I maintain my collection, even adding to it. Now guided by impulses I don't question, I no longer fear. The 3:33 a.m. connection, I've become a junction point, a human switchboard, routing communications, whose purpose I may never understand sometimes. Walking past peonieses long since disconnected from any network, I hear them ringing. I see others pause, looking around in confusion at sounds they barely register. Sometimes I answer these public phones, pressing the receivers to my ear so the bone conduction can begin relaying messages to the growing network of human conductors across the country. And sometimes I dial out my fingers, circling a phantom rotary connecting to others like me. I speak their full legal names and instruct them to mark their presence. Dial 33, the network is expanding, the signal grows stronger with each new node. We're all connected now. All part of the circuit, we're all waiting for whatever is trying to come through. Story 4, I remember the first time I noticed the three figures looming in the early morning haze. The air had felt heavier than usual. That Sunday thick fog clung to the ground like a damp veil, and the faint smell of eucalyptus was undercut by something metallic, almost like an old penny held too long between sweaty palms. My chest tightened, and I wondered if I was coming down with something yet. I told myself it was only the cold dawn air teasing my lungs. Still, a prickly awareness spread across the back of my neck, as though some unseen presence flickered just at the edge of vision. I've been running in that park every Sunday at 6 in the morning for as long as I can remember. The routine usually brings me peace. My own private therapy session between swaths of dense green with a chorus of birds, sometimes cheering me on, but about 6 weeks ago, something changed. Or maybe I changed. I began to see them, three young men who looked so comically out of place they had to be some kind of prank. Each wore a fluorescent tank top, tight jogging shorts, and pristine white sneakers that practically glowed in the dim light. Their mullets were styled too perfectly, as if they had stepped right out of 1987. Without a hair out of place the first time our paths crossed, they looked up at me with the strangest expression. Cross between delight and expectation, one of them gestured at a battered leather basketball he carried, nodding as if to say, "You in?" I tried to ignore them, jogging past with a polite wave, but the following Sunday they were there again, standing near a line of eucalyptus trees, silhouettes half hidden by swirling mist. The same basketball gleamed with a dull shine, threads of worn leather splitting at the seams. Their invitation felt unspoken but obvious. Something flickered in their eyes, an urgency, almost predatory curiosity. I ran faster that day, the pounding in my chest more from nerves than from exertion. By the third Sunday, curiosity had tangled me in its grip. I found myself slowing down as I approached them. They seemed younger than I'd first thought, or maybe just unnaturally energetic. One of them held the ball out, an offer both simple and full of subtle menace. He said something along the lines of, "Let's shoot some hoops," but not in so many words. It was more the tilt of his head and the flick of his wrist. There was an odd resonance to his voice, as though coming from far away, warped and hollow. I felt my heartbeat thudding in my ears and my breath caught in my throat. Despite the sense of unease twisting in my stomach, I was drawn in. I had my own reasons for finally saying yes. Perhaps part of me thought I was dreaming, or maybe I just needed to see if the tension coiled inside my head was real. So I nodded. I recall they brightened at my acceptance, and then each stepped aside, revealing a narrow path between the eucalyptus trees that I had never noticed in all my years of running there. It wasn't just that I had missed it before, it was that it simply did not exist, but now it did. And behind it lay a worn basketball court. That court looked old from the chain link fence that sagged at one corner to the bleachers with splintered wood. But there was something else. Every line on the court seemed to glow faintly like neon residue that couldn't decide if it belonged in the present. The scoreboard, perched at an impossible angle, flickered with unreadable numbers. I heard a strange hiss in the wind, almost like muffled laughter or frantic applause. My body hummed with anxiety, every muscle tensing as if preparing for a confrontation. The three men bounded toward the free throw line, dribbling the ball with practiced ease when I stepped onto the cracked asphalt. It was colder than I expected. My breath turned ragged. I bent my knees, lowering my center of gravity. Expecting them to pass me the ball instead, the one with the most perfect mullet rolled the ball gently across the court, letting it bounce only once with that single bounce. Everything changed: the backboard, the rim, the paint lines. Even the sagging fence, one by one, they dissolved into a swirling cloud of luminescent dust. It was like watching a photograph burn away in reverse. I felt a rush of cold wind swirl around me, and in an instant I was standing alone on bare dirt. No trace of asphalt underfoot, my stomach clenched with an almost nauseating dread. The sunlight filtering through the eucalyptus canopy looked dimmer, and the sky above had taken a sickly gray tint. The strangest part was the total silence. Not a single rustle of leaves, not even the distant hum of traffic. I was alone, heart-hammering sweat trickling down my temples. The dryness in my mouth made me swallow hard. My legs trembled so much I could barely stand the trio. The ball, even the weird court, had vanished, replaced by an achingly empty patch of land. It might have been part of the park's wilderness, a place I'd never ventured, but it also might have existed outside the park entirely. Time seemed to stutter. One moment I felt sure only a few seconds had passed. The next it seemed an hour could have slipped by. I tried to retrace my steps to find the path back to the main running trail, but the eucalyptus line looked different. The trunks were spaced irregularly like gnarled sentinels twisted by some hidden force. When I finally found my way back to the park's main loop, I felt unsteady. My breath still came in ragged gasps, and my pulse thundered in my temples. The Sunday crowd was beginning to trickle in. Joggers, dog walkers, a few early morning yoga enthusiasts. None seemed to notice my disheveled state. Adrenaline still coursed through me, and I remember gulping down water from a nearby fountain, its metallic taste making me gag. I questioned my own sanity. The entire ride home the following weeks were a haze of sleepless nights and anxious days. I debated telling anyone about what I had experienced. Eventually, I convinced a friend, someone I occasionally run with, to come with me. I needed validation, or at least some witness who could confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. We arrived at the park before sunrise, each wearing a determined expression. I was so tense that my shoulders ached, and the first steps of our jog felt like trudging through wet cement. My friend commented that the air tasted stale, as if trapped in a sealed room. For years, I took it as a sign around the same bend at precisely 6 o'clock in the morning. I saw them again, or maybe felt them is more accurate. They stood near the same line of eucalyptus, the basketball tucked beneath one guy's arm. My friend squinted in their direction but showed only mild confusion. He told me they appeared odd, like part of some retro-themed photo shoot. Then he said that one of them beckoned us over. I froze, chest tightening painfully, but forced myself to move forward. They pointed beyond the eucalyptus. My friend seemed uncertain. He whispered that he heard a distant whistle, something like an old-school referee call. I tried to keep my breath steady the second we stepped onto the path. Though I noticed that the court was back, but this time it looked newer, like a fresh coat of paint had been laid down just hours before. A scoreboard flickered, the stand seemingly brimming with ghostly shadows. My friend, however, insisted he saw nothing but me stepping into an overgrown clearing. He said that the trees looked like giant spinning cogs in the corner of his vision, rotating with a squeaking grind. A nauseous wave of dizziness hit me. I could hear phantom cheers, the squeak of sneakers on polished hardwood. Even though I stood outdoors in that same peculiar hush that crept in and out like a faulty radio signal, sweat rolled down my spine, soaking the back of my shirt. My friend said that from his vantage point, I was just standing there, arms raised as if taking imaginary shots. He thought I had lost my mind, but he also admitted he could hear invisible cheerleaders chanting, though he couldn't see them. That's when fear twisted inside me like a serpent. Reality was warping in two different ways for each of us. Neither version matched, and neither felt safe. I tried to dribble the ball, but my friend shouted at me that I was just pounding my palm against empty air. Meanwhile, I felt real leather beneath my fingertips, could sense the weight of the ball as it bounced back. The tension in my chest turned into a suffocating grip, and my lungs begged for more oxygen than I could manage to draw in. I wanted to drop the ball to run, but I seemed rooted to the spot. The hair on my arm stood on end, and a buzzing sound like high voltage wires filled my ears. The scoreboard flickered numbers rolling by in a frenzy, though I couldn't decipher them all at once. The hoop disappeared, dissolving into that same glowing powder the stands followed, then the court lines until the entire structure vanished again, leaving behind only bare, uneven earth in the blink of an eye. I was alone. My friend had inched backwards several yards, watching in confusion as I reappeared in the real clearing. He said he saw my figure flicker for a moment like a failing projection face contorted with terror. He swore the palm trees around us spun in a slow circle, each trunk rotating on its axis as if they were mechanical contraptions. He heard the faint echo of a buzzer, and then it was gone for days after I couldn't stop replaying the incident in my mind. Everything felt distorted. The taste of my food, the color of the sky, even the texture of my own skin. I developed a stutter in my breathing as though I was always on the verge of hyperventilating. I imagined the three mullet-wearing men lurking in every shadow at dawn, waiting with that battered ball. The memory of their outdated clothes and vacant grins was burned into my retinas. I avoided the park out of a primal sense of dread, but deep down some twisted curiosity pulled at me. I had come face to face with something not just supernatural, but perhaps from a dimension that bled into ours under the right conditions. Eventually, the nightmares forced me to confront it once more. My dreams were feverish loops where I raced around a kaleidoscopic court, a scoreboard screaming zero after zero, and those three men floated above the rim, mocking me with silent laughter. My heart would pound so hard I'd jerk awake, bathed in sweat. My mouth drier than desert air, sitting alone in my living room at 3 a.m. I would question if I was making all of this up, yet the dread was too tangible, too physically rooted in my chest to be mere imagination. I returned to the park before dawn on a Sunday, 7 weeks after the first sighting. Each step felt like an act of defiance against an unseen threat. The eucalyptus trees loomed taller than I remembered, branches swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel. My pulse thumped loudly in my ears, and I had trouble swallowing. The sky was still dark, illuminated only by the weak glow of street lamps far behind me. I walked the path slowly, this time not running as though any sudden movement might trigger the phenomenon again. Nothing, no sign of them, just me in the hush of a sleeping park. Relief and disappointment tangled in my chest. My exhalation trembled and I felt the adrenaline fade, leaving me shaky. Maybe I was free of this. Maybe the hold they had on me was broken. My muscles relaxed slightly and I started to jog, focusing on the comforting rhythm of my footsteps. Then I caught a flicker of neon in my peripheral vision. I stopped mid-stride, breath catching in my throat, the faint crunch of gravel behind me. I turned, heart hammering so forcefully I could barely see straight there beyond the eucalyptus line. I spotted a glimmer of green and pink spandex. My stomach dropped as I saw one of them step out. Holding the leather ball at his side, his mullet glistened as if coated in morning dew. He didn't speak or gesture, he just stared. The hush of the park seemed to intensify, pressing against my eardrums. I felt my legs tense, my body ready to bolt. But a strange resolution settled over me. Perhaps it was the fight or flight response. I edged closer, each breath tortured and shallow. The other two emerged behind him, forming a triangle of pastel horror, their eyes reflecting unnatural light. An image of that dissolving court flashed in my mind, how it crumbled into glowing dust, how it left me isolated in that void-like space. Yet I refused to move, my entire being shivered. But I held my ground suddenly. The lead figure tossed the basketball toward me, a slow, deliberate arc that seemed to hang in midair for a moment too long. My instincts kicked in. I caught it the instant my fingers met the scuffed leather. I felt that same jolt of electricity run through my arms, spiking my pulse. I could hear the echo of an invisible crowd, a roaring wave of excitement. But the three men didn't approach instead. They began to fade, merging with the backdrop of trees and swirling darkness. My vision tunneled, my heart hammered to an almost painful rhythm. I could barely breathe, as if the air had turned solid. I was left holding the ball, the neon edges of their presence swimming away like phantoms. There was no dissolving court this time, no dramatic transformation, just me trembling in the dim light with that battered ball in my hands. I wanted to fling it away, to rid myself of this object that linked me to them. But for reasons beyond my comprehension, I couldn't unclench my hands. After what felt like hours, I managed to place the ball on the ground. Gently, a wave of dizziness overcame me, and I stumbled backward, nearly collapsing onto the damp grass. In that moment, I sensed an unspoken understanding. I was free to leave, but this wouldn't be the last time we crossed paths. The fleeting shape of the three figures seemed etched into the air, a residual afterimage scorched into the retinas of my mind. I fled the park, breathing so hard my lungs burned. My shirt clung to my body, drenched in cold sweat. My heart continued its relentless punishing beat all the way home. The entire drive back, I kept glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them crammed into my back seat, or perhaps floating above the street eyes, shining like taillights. It's been several days since that encounter. I haven't returned to the park. Every time I pass by its entrance, I feel that prickly dread creep up my spine, accompanied by a vivid memory of neon tank tops and silent stares. Yet part of me knows that if I pushed open those gates at dawn, I would find them again, or at least the echo of their presence. I still hear the faint squeak of rubber soles on asphalt. When I close my eyes at night, I still feel the weight of that old basketball in my hands, the worn leather pressing against my skin like the lingering imprint of a dream. I can't fully shake. I don't know if they are trapped in time or if the court exists on some overlapping plane of reality. Maybe they're tied to some echo of 1987, doomed to replay the same invitation every Sunday at 6. Or perhaps it's my own madness conjured by an overactive mind, hungry for meaning in the darkness. All I know is that whenever I recall that swirl of luminescent dust, my breath hitches and a cold sweat slicks my palms. I remain haunted by the whisper of a referee's whistle. No one else can hear when the sun sets and the shadows stretch long. I sometimes picture them waiting for me under the eucalyptus canopy, the ball scuffed and ready. I imagine the hush of the crowd that isn't there, the flicker of a scoreboard from a past that refuses to stay buried. My heart pounds and my throat dries, but I can't fully deny the pull. I'm safe for now, but not certain how long it will last. The strange synergy between their realm and mine lingers, and with each passing Sunday it grows stronger. I sense that one day the boundary might break for good, leaving me stranded on a court that exists only in nightmares alone, but never entirely alone. That possibility claws at me in the restless hours before dawn. Still, I hold on to the tiniest thread of hope that what I face can be outrun. Yet, every time I close my eyes, the echo of bouncing leather and phantom cheers reminds me that some things once seen refuse to let you go. And so I lie awake, adrenaline coursing through my veins, waiting for the next Sunday morning when the eucalyptus groves might reveal a court that's not meant to be found. Story 5. The first hint that something in my life had gone irreparably wrong came just before dawn last week, when I woke to find the mirror in my living room dripping from the inside. In the half-light of my apartment, a pale silvery fluid bled behind the glass, forming rivulets that smeared across my reflection. That fluid glinted like mercury trailing downward in erratic veins. Instead of feeling curious, I was consumed by an immediate suffocating dread, as if an unseen hand had reached through the glass and clutched at my insides. My heart hammered so violently that my ribcage ached with every throb. Even in that moment of terror, I recognized something about the mirror I had asked for. This, I suppose, the whole ordeal began with my superstition. Though my line of work doesn't normally condone such irrationalities, I'm a day trader. I specialize in rapid movements of stocks, foreign exchange markets, and futures. By the end of most days, I feel either unstoppable or utterly defeated, a volatile pendulum that rarely rests in a comfortable middle. As any day trader can confirm, we live and die by our own decisions. Profit and loss can balance on a razor's edge of uncertainty. That uncertainty got under my skin. I grew to resent the unpredictability, and in my exhaustion, I found myself drawn to the idea that I could tip fate in my favor by appealing to something beyond the usual logic of charts and data. One night after a particularly grueling session, I visited a local antiques fair. I don't know why I went in the first place. Something about rummaging through objects older than I am seemed like a fitting distraction from the relentless screens. I came across this peculiar mirror with a cracked wooden frame. Its edges were chipped and darkened by age, and a spiderweb of fine fractures spread across the backing. The seller insisted it was from some distant estate sale and that it had a so-called rich history at the time. I remember thinking it looked like the perfect prop in a dime store horror flick, but as soon as I locked eyes with my reflection in that old glass, an idea took root in my mind. Maybe the mirror, with all its storied background, carried some intangible energy that could be harnessed. It sounds ridiculous in retrospect, but at that moment desperation guided my reasoning, more than any real logic ever could. So I bought the mirror, took it home, and propped it up in my living room that same night. Actually, early morning, when I was too wired to sleep, I found myself staring at the reflective surface, feeling the weight of my recent trading losses pressing on my chest. My breath came shallow and sweat clung to the back of my neck. A madness of sorts compelled me to make an offering. I rummaged around desperate for something to write with until I noticed a lipstick tube tucked into a crack along the mirror's wooden frame. Maybe it had belonged to the previous owner, maybe it was just left there. As an odd coincidence, without a second thought, I used that lipstick to scroll a promise across the glass, a deal offering a portion of my fortune in exchange for consistent, unstoppable profits in the market. I was no writer of pacts. My words were frantic and unsteady. The red lipstick smeared easily and my hand trembled as I wrote. Yet I felt almost giddy, as though some primal part of me believed I had tapped into forces capable of bending reality to my will. When I woke the next day, the writing was gone, not merely wiped away, but vanished entirely. The glass was so smooth it appeared polished, with no trace of that desperate plea. For a moment I doubted I had done it at all, wondering if exhaustion had driven me to hallucinate. Yet what happened later that day shattered all ambiguity. I traded a set of options that by every rational analysis should have been worthless. Something pushed me to go against all the fundamental indicators. My entire body buzzed with anxiety. But I placed the order anyway. By the close of the market, the stock had executed a move so improbable that I doubled my investment in less than an hour. The feeling was euphoric, but also unnerving. It was as though I had hit some cosmic jackpot. That same evening, after the markets closed, I noticed the mirror. The reflective surface had become hazy, as though a fine mist clung to the interior side of the glass. I tried wiping it with a cloth, but the haze wouldn't disappear. Then I saw something that stopped me. Cold, faint fingerprints pressed against the inside of the mirror. They were not my prints. They didn't match the pattern of my own ridges, and their size was slightly larger than my hand. I felt my throat tighten. A cold dread seeped down my spine, and I forced myself to look away, convincing myself I was only seeing illusions brought on by the day's stress. But illusions don't drip over the next few days. The mirror began producing the faint trickle of that silvery liquid behind the glass. I could see it in my peripheral vision, sliding slowly downward like tears. But whenever I turned to face it directly, The trails would vanish, leaving me unsure if they had truly been there. My chest tightened, often my hands would shake. I felt the dryness in my mouth and a thin layer of sweat chilled my forehead. Yet for all this horror, my trading soared. Every pick I made turned to gold. People in my day trading circle started calling me the man with the golden gut behind their nods of approval. I detected a flicker of envy, but I took their admiration in silent stride the day after my second major win. I noticed something else every time I sold my positions. The hazy prints on the mirror would shift, forming shapes that looked like arrows pointing downward or bizarre negative symbols that felt like a warning. If I tried to shrug off these signals, the next morning I would find objects in my apartment cracked perfectly in half my drinking glasses, a vase in the corner, even the old picture frame with my parents' photo. No mention of them passing away. We just don't keep in touch. Each crack was diagonal precise, like some invisible blade had sliced right through them. Whenever I heard that splintering sound, my heart would spike to a tempo so violent it felt like it might burst. A strange rhythm took over my life. I began to treat the mirror like a living thing, trying to appease it by adjusting my trades according to the signals it offered. If the prints formed arrows, I would hold off on selling. If they were shaped like plus signs, I would execute a buy. This system felt insane, yet it worked profit after profit. My account swelled, and each triumph in the market brought with it a pang of foreboding, as if I was being guided to a place I didn't want to go. The voice in my head kept whispering that I had bargained for this, even if I hadn't truly believed in it. At the time, then the nightmares started in them. The mirror grew tall as a doorway, and I would see a shape on the other side. It wore my suit jacket and tie, but the face was obscured by a glimmering, featureless mask like polished silver, reflecting everything but revealing nothing. The shape would tap on the glass from the inside, and I'd feel each tap echo in my pulse, a hollow throbbing that shook me awake in a cold sweat. Some nights I'd wake to the distinct sound of knuckles rapping on the mirror in the living room, but when I turned on the lights, the apartment would be silent, empty, and that monstrous hush would press against my ears, leaving me dizzy with dread. I tried talking to a friend, an older trader who prided himself on calm logic. Though I used indirect language, he inferred I was heading toward a breakdown. He suggested I take a break from trading and maybe consult a therapist. I never came to mention the mirror specifically. I wasn't sure how to describe it without sounding deranged, so I simply nodded at his advice. That same night I dreamt that I recounted the entire story to that masked reflection, and it only stared back at me, the silver face expressionless, the identical suit mocking me by fitting it better than I ever could. Over time, the sense of being watched seeped into every corner of my daily routine. I would feel it when I showered, half expecting to see a figure in the steamy bathroom mirror. I would sense it when I scrolled through trading charts on my phone, feeling a chill in the air as though a presence hovered behind my chair. Sometimes the overhead lights flickered, the persistent hum of my computer monitors seemed louder, more like an electronic hiss. In these moments, I'd notice a gnawing sensation in my gut, as if I were teetering at the edge of a precipice about to tumble into something dark and bottomless. Last week, that final jolt of realization came. I had gone to bed after an unusually large wind, my chest still fluttering with adrenaline, my arms clammy from the tension in the middle of the night. I woke to get water from the kitchen, passing the living room. I glanced at the mirror in the dim light. At first, I only registered that something about the reflection was off. Then the full horror of it struck the scene. Inside the mirror showed my office, my trading setup, my desk, even the messy piles of documents, but I wasn't in it. The chair was empty yet. There was someone else sitting there wearing my clothes, hunched over the desk, their head turned to face me, revealing that same faceless mask of polished silver. My throat went tight. My breath caught in my lungs, and a deep terror burrowed into my core. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my mouth. The figure stood, walked closer to the glass from its side, then raised a gloved hand and tapped on the inside. Each knock vibrated through my living room like a muffled heartbeat. The mask's blank surface caught the faint glow of my table lamp, making it flash like a blade. The next day, I tried to go about my trading routine, but every time I looked at the screen, I was assaulted by intrusive thoughts. I kept remembering that reflection, the silver visage and the uncomfortable precision of the figure's movements. My trades that day were still profitable, but I felt no joy. My heart pounded so hard I worried about fainting when I blinked. I thought I saw flickers of that reflective face in the black screen after the trading software closed. Then the culminating moment happened 2 nights ago. My profits had reached a new high, an unimaginable number that should have made me proud or at least relieved. Instead, I found myself pacing around my apartment, feeling the walls closing in. In the silence, I heard a whisper like the faint scratch of metal on glass. It was not my voice and did not seem to come from any identifiable direction. The sound surged in volume, a scraping squeal that hurt my ears and my mind. It resembled a demand, a command for me to approach the mirror. My throat went dry as sand. My hands trembled uncontrollably, yet part of me couldn't resist. I trudged to the living room steps, heavy with dread in the mirror. The same haunting scene reappeared, my office. Devoid of me, but occupied by the figure in my clothes. This time the figure held up a hand, beckoning me forward, pressing that silver face right to the glass. My heart banged so hard it hurt. Every muscle in my body was screaming to flee, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure rapped on the inside of the mirror, a gesture that vibrated through my chest. Its stance told me everything it wanted to switch places. It wanted me on the other side, looking out at the world through a barrier I might never break again. I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a side table. The overhead light flickered, plunging the room into a strobe of brightness and shadow. I felt a swirl of panic in my gut, as though I might vomit my reflection. Or rather, the figure wearing my reflection continued to knock the motions growing more urgent. Streams of silvery liquid oozed inside the glass, swirling around that dreadful shape. My eyes burned and my vision blurred with tears, or maybe with that strange reflection dancing in my periphery. In a moment of raw desperation, I grabbed the nearest object, a dusty cloth from the table, and flung it at the mirror covering the glass for a second. The knocking stopped. The hush was overwhelming, a pregnant silence that made my eardrums ring. I fell to my knees, gripping the edge of the coffee table for support, my lungs heaving. Sweat trickled down the back of my neck and my pulse pounded as though it wanted to tear free from my veins. A wave of dizziness threatened to sweep me away as I realized I had no plan. No sense of how to proceed. I spent the next day avoiding my apartment, wandering the city, aimlessly trying to choke down coffee. I couldn't taste forcing food. Past a throat that felt perpetually clenched, I ignored the trading software on my phone, though I knew that if I looked I'd see new opportunities to ride my winning streak. But the thought of increasing my fortune felt obscene now, like feeding a monstrous shadow I had invited into my life when I finally worked up the nerve to return home late that night. I found the living room dark. The cloth still draped over the mirror. I heard no sound. For a brief moment I felt a surge of naive hope that maybe, just maybe, I had broken the link. That illusion shattered when I saw my reflection in the hallway mirror. My face looked normal, but the corner of my mouth glinted with a metallic sheen as though a droplet of that silvery fluid clung to my lip. I wiped my face in a panic, but there was no moisture, no sign of anything. My heart hammered with renewed force and a scream clawed at my throat, yet I remained silent, too terrified to make a sound. Last night, my phone buzzed with message alerts. Fellow traders were celebrating some unprecedented market rally, but I couldn't focus. My gaze kept drifting to the mirror, still covered, but humming with attention. I could feel in my bones. It was as though the entity inside was waiting. I decided then that I couldn't live like this, half certain that my next breath might be stolen by something from the other side. I resolved to break the mirror, to destroy the path I had opened. I went to the closet, rummaged for a hammer, and returned to the living room, trembling with a fear so profound my teeth shattered. Standing before the covered mirror, I hesitated. My gut twisted with a dire sense of caution, like shattering that glass might unleash whatever lurked behind it, freeing it into my world. The cold metal of the hammer weighed heavy in my hand, and sweat slicked my grip. My heart raced each beat, a violent explosion in my chest. For a moment I could almost hear a voice behind the cloth, a whisper urging me to remove the covering and look into the face behind the silver mask. But I couldn't bring myself to strike. Instead, I took slow, shaking steps backward, then sprinted out of the apartment. Adrenaline blasting through me, I jumped in my car and drove aimlessly until dawn, heart pounding against my ribs, tears of desperation burning my eyes. Now I sit in a motel on the outskirts of the city writing this, with trembling hands, my laptop. Flickers on the chip table, the screen displaying the market's opening bell. I can't bring myself to trade my mind. Replays that reflection over and over, I keep imagining the silver mask pressing against the glass. Each knock a summons, I wonder if the old mirror, dusty cloth still draped across it, is waiting for me at home, or if it already found a way to slip out of the confines of the glass. Occasionally I glance at the cheap mirror above the motel sink, half expecting to see a glimmer of mercury or that faceless figure in my clothes. Every part of me feels clenched and raw, as though electricity crackles just beneath my skin. My pulse hasn't slowed. My breath is shallow. I taste bile in my throat each time I consider returning to face that monstrous reflection. But I can't avoid it forever. The longer I stay away, the more I sense an invisible tether pulling me back. This was my doing. I practically scrolled an invitation with that stolen lipstick, offering a piece of myself for the fleeting thrill of unstoppable profits. And now I have to pay. I'm not sure what I'll do next. I'm torn between destroying the mirror once and for all or trying to break the agreement in some other sure way, assuming sanity has any place in what I've become entangled with. I replay mental images of me raising that hammer, smashing the glass, and being showered in shards that slice through my clothes in diagonal perfect cuts. No one perishes in that vision, but something about the aftermath is always too disturbing to endure. One thing is certain, I can't continue the money in my accounts. Feels poisonous, a ticking bomb that underscores my bargain. My entire body vibrates with dread at the thought that the reflection might succeed in taking my place. Wearing my suit, sitting at my desk, living my life on the outside while I'm trapped behind the glass. Even writing these words triggers a surge of nausea, and I feel my heart surge in panic. I glance at the motel mirror again and see only my own terrified face, but I no longer trust it to remain that way. This is my confession, or perhaps my testament to whatever cruel cosmic forces toy with mortal greed. I may walk back into that apartment tonight and find the cloth on the floor, the mirror beckoning me, the silver mask waiting, or I may gather the courage to break it in one swing, risking whatever that unleashes. Either way, I sense there's no true victory here. The best I can hope for is an uneasy standoff between me and the haunted artifact I unleashed with my own hand. Even as I type these final words, the hair on my arm stands on end and a cold sweat slicks my brow. The motel room seems darker than it was a moment ago, and I can almost hear a faint tapping as if from the hallway mirror or the antique glass so many miles away. My pulse pounds loud in my ears, and a hollow ache constricts my chest. The breath I take now feels like it might be my last gulp of free air before something tries to claim me. Yet I cling to the hope that I haven't completely lost control, perhaps. Acknowledging my folly is the first step to escaping it. I've survived these past weeks without succumbing fully. If there's any resolution ahead, it won't come gently. I brace for the possibility that when I finally confront that mirror again, I'll see my office once more empty except for a masked entity that taps on the glass commanding me to trade places, and I will resist with every shred of will I have left, hoping that's enough to sever the link and reclaim my own reflection for good. If I fail, I'll remain in that endless echo of silver eyes and dripping mercury, haunted by the reflection I conjured in my moment of desperate greed. If I succeed, I may find peace, though the memory of that entity's hollow tapping will haunt my nights forever. Story 6, I still remember how the overhead lights seemed to flicker when I stepped into the plane's cabin. For the first time on that fateful trip, the air felt thick, as though something heavy clung to every molecule, making my skin crawl. Even the usual hum of the engine sounded slightly off, warbling like a chorus out of tune. Maybe it was just my anxiety playing tricks on me, but deep down I sensed it was more than that. Something about that flight, about every flight. Scents made the hairs on my arms stand at attention, made my heart pound so hard I thought everyone around me could hear it. It was as if the plane itself was exhaling a long, low groan of warning. I've never liked flying, but for years I managed to keep that fear at bay by staying awake during the flight and distracting myself with movies or reading. Whenever I felt the panic rising, I'd snap open my laptop or stream a random film. I absolutely refused to sleep on a plane, convinced that if I let my guard down, something terrible would happen. That first time I dozed off mid-flight was the spark that ignited my current nightmare. I only nodded off for a moment, but it was enough to unleash the most vivid dream I'd ever experienced, and since then it keeps haunting. Every time I approached a boarding gate, my heart rate spiked. My palms were so damp with sweat that I constantly wiped them on my pants. My neck felt taut muscles trembling with tension. I could hear my pulse in my ears, that maddening whoosh that drowned out every other sound. Even the voices of gate attendants calling out boarding zones sounded muffled. Distant people in line seemed oblivious to my inner turmoil, shuffling forward as though everything was normal on my most recent flight when I first glimpsed my seat 17. I hesitated in the aisle. The overhead lights flickered again like they did on that original flight that started everything. It felt like the plane was exhaling a silent threat for a moment. I was sure I smelled something acrid and familiar, a faint odor of kerosene or old machine oil. I touched my shirt pocket, reflexively bracing myself for that jolt of confusion and fear. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a hammer against my ribs. I lowered myself into the seat, trying to breathe slowly so I wouldn't pass out. I vowed to stay awake no matter the cost. I ordered the strongest coffee the flight attendant, a regular modern-day attendant, could offer and clutched the paper cup in both hands. Drinking sip after scalding sip, my throat felt raw and sweat rolled down the back of my neck as the engines roared for takeoff. My fingernails dug into my armrests. I could feel every bump and shift in altitude. My mind started playing tricks on me again. Every creak from the cabin sounded like footsteps approaching. The overhead light seemed to glow too brightly before dimming unexpectedly, as if the electricity was surging in uneven pulses. At some point I must have blinked too long or let my guard slip. I didn't even realize I was drifting until the dream surfaced, pulling me under like a riptide. The navy blue uniform from 1969 came into focus immediately. It was the same flight attendant, her expression disturbingly neutral. I wanted to scream that I wasn't responsible for anything, that I just wanted to survive the flight, but my voice wouldn't work. She reached forward and grabbed my shirt pocket. I felt the pin of the badge pierce the fabric like a needle through skin. Then she leaned in that same whisper, "Now you're responsible." In the dream, I sensed a violent jolt. The plane rattled as if we had hit a wall of turbulent air. My seatbelt seemed too loose, and I felt myself lifting off the seat for a second before slamming back down the dream, and reality overlapped in a dizzying haze. My stomach lurched, and I tasted the acidic bite of coffee mixed with bile. I was drenched in sweatshirt sticking to my body. My fingers twitched uncontrollably, trying to brace for the next drop. But there was no brace to be found in a world that felt so unreal. When I opened my eyes, I saw people around me clutching their seats, faces frozen in fear. One man to my left had an expression of absolute shock, as though something impossible had just occurred. Several overhead compartments hung open, luggage peeking out. My seatbelt was buckled, yet I felt as if I had been on my feet mere moments earlier. My ears rang with a high-pitched hum, and the main cabin lights flickered again. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, stating that the flight should have been smooth, and he had no explanation for the sudden turbulence. There was a weird hush among the passengers. It felt like we had all experienced something unexplainable, but no one dared speak of it. After the plane landed, a couple of people timidly approached me in the jet bridge. They said they had watched me stand up during that horrendous bout of turbulence with my eyes half shut, calmly pointing out the nearest exits. They insisted it was like I was in a trance or under someone else's control. I felt shaky, my legs barely supporting me. My chest felt so tight I could hardly breathe for an instant. I glanced at my shirt pocket, and sure enough, the battered old badge was pinned there, shining faintly under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the airport corridor. The smell of fuel made my stomach churn. I tried yanking it off, nearly tearing the cloth people who saw me do it. Backed away uneasy, but not sure why. I felt compelled to alert the airline again when I showed up at the support desk. They passed me along to a manager who recognized my name. That recognition sparked a bit of panic in his eyes. He asked me about the flight, about what I'd experienced. I answered in halting, shaky phrases, feeling my pulse throb in my temples. The manager seemed both nervous and oddly excited. He muttered that they'd do more research, but in the meantime, my seat assignment for future flights would remain 17. The way he said it as if there were no alternative, made my heart skip a beat. My palms felt clammy and I wiped them on my pants again as if trying to erase the entire experience days past, and I tried to put it all out of my mind. Yet I kept waking up in cold sweats at home, the echo of that dream ringing in my ears. I'd smell that pungent kerosene in my apartment, even though I lived nowhere near an airport. I started to suspect it clung to my clothes or my skin whenever I tried to shower it off. The water felt too cold, piercing my skin like needles at night. Shadows in the corners of my bedroom seemed to move when I wasn't looking. I'd hear faint whispers, and sometimes I'd catch the reflection of that 1969 flight attendant in a darkened window, her eyes boring into me like a silent accusation. My therapist tried to assure me that these experiences could be a manifestation of my phobia. I was taught coping mechanisms, breathing exercises, grounding techniques, even suggestions about hypnosis to break the cycle. But the line between dream and reality had already blurred too much each time I boarded a plane. I felt the oppressive weight in the cabin as though the seats and the walls held secrets from decades past. I'm scheduled to fly again soon, once again assigned to 17. The airline says it's an upgrade, the best seat for a fearful flyer, as if that makes sense after everything that's happened. But I can't shake the dread clinging to me. My heart speeds up whenever I even think about walking through the jet bridge. I've been trying to interpret that final whisper from the dream, the part where she said this landing would be the last I'm terrified of. What that implies, I've contemplated canceling the trip, driving instead, or even quitting my job if they insist on flying me out. But some force, whether internal or external, keeps drawing me back to that seat right now. I'm sitting at home passively staring at the confirmation email for my flight that departs tomorrow. My chest is tight with dread. I glance at the small badge sitting on my kitchen table, surrounded by plastic zip bags and paper towels. In a failed attempt to quarantine the smell, the stale week of fuel hasn't dissipated. The battered airline logo from 1969 has begun to peel at the corners, revealing a thin layer of rusted metal beneath the plastic. There's an itching sensation at the base of my skull that tells me I have to see this through or it will haunt me. Indefinitely, the sense of responsibility weighs heavily on my shoulders, exactly like she said in the dream. I don't know what will happen when I take my seat in 17. My hands are trembling just from typing. That perhaps I'll resist sleep by flooding my system with caffeine, refusing to close my eyes for even a second. Or maybe I'll let it happen, let the dream unfold and see if it offers any answers. The unspoken threat in her voice, the next landing will be final echoes through my thoughts. I imagine the ground rushing toward me or the possibility of stepping off that plane forever changed yet again. But I will board the plane because the alternative is living in perpetual dread, never knowing what it all means. My fear of flying has morphed into a deeper terror of the unknown. There's no guarantee I'll find peace after this, but I can't continue half awake in the corners of my own life. Even as I write these words, my heart thrums like a jackhammer, sending jolts of anxiety through my chest. My mouth is so dry it's painful to swallow and my fingers quiver on the keyboard. Tomorrow I'll walk down that jet bridge pinned between other travelers chatting about work and vacations. I'll see 17A and force myself to sit the moment the engines rev up. I'll feel that oppressive pressure in my chest. Then the wheels will leave the tarmac and the seatbelt sign will glow overhead. My stomach will clench as the plane ascends into the clouds, and with every passing second, I'll be fighting the primal urge to keep my eyes open if I lose that battle. If I drift off, I know exactly who will appear in my dream, and I know exactly what she'll say. I can't tell you how it will end. Only that the dread has become a tangible presence in my life. I sense it behind me like a phantom whenever I turn off the lights or pass a reflective surface. Her uniform, her whisper, the smell of kerosene. They're all part of me now. This is my reality. The seat 17, the intangible turbulence, and the flight attendant who refuses to let go. Whether I can break the cycle or not, I have to try, because if I don't, the fear itself might become my new normal, an endless loop of haunted flights and dreamlike revelations. So I'm stepping onto that plane. I'm accepting this so-called upgrade, even though my breath is already ragged, even though my pulse is still pounding. I'll do it because if there's one thing worse than confronting a terror that defies logic, it's running from it indefinitely still. As I pack my carry-on, the final words of that nightmare echo in my mind like a curse. The next landing will be final, no matter what that means. I can't run anymore. I'll face the flight seat 17A and hope that whatever outcome awaits me, it won't cast a shadow. I can never escape Story 7. I sensed an unsettling presence the moment I brought that porcelain doll home. Even before I opened the bag, I felt as though the air around me had thickened, weighed down by a quiet, watchful tension. It was as if something keenly awaited its release from a long slumber, poised to drift across the threshold of my home and settle into the shadows. By the time I placed the doll inside the illuminated glass cabinet in my hallway, my hands were trembling with anticipation. I couldn't entirely explain that was just the beginning. Now I'm left questioning every odd reflection, every flickering glow, every echo of a voice, wondering whether there's something far more sinister at play than an old curiosity from a rural fair. I found the doll at a strange little market I stumbled upon one autumn weekend. I had driven out of town to meet a friend who collected obscure knickknacks and recommended a curiosities fair he'd seen advertised. I arrived to find an assemblage of worn tents, half of them teetering in the wind on the outskirts of a dusty parking lot. It looked more like a yard sale for the bazaar than any formal event. Vendors hawked everything from antique cutlery to misshapen taxidermy. But among that disheveled display of odds and ends, a booth at the far end caught my attention. Its proprietor stood behind a wooden table, his pale eyes scanning the passers-by without saying a word. Spread across his table were porcelain figurines, each meticulously painted, each wearing a distinct expression. At first glance, none of them appealed to me. Then I noticed tucked in the corner an odd-sized doll that stood about as tall as a house cat. Its dark moss-green dress was frayed at the edges, and its glassy eyes gleamed with a lifelike quality that felt uncomfortably human, despite a sense of unease gnawing at my stomach. I picked it up. Its weight surprised me. It was heavier than it looked. The vendor named a price, and I didn't bother to haggle. I wanted it, though I couldn't explain why. When I got home, I placed the doll in my hallway cabinet, a piece of furniture with glass doors and a motion sensor light. The interior lights would normally click on whenever someone passed by, yet it seemed the doll had other ideas over the next few days. I noticed the light flickered to life even when no one was near. At first I chalked it up to a wiring glitch, but each time the sensor misfired, the doll's face appeared illuminated in a way that chilled my blood. Its eyes seemed to follow me as I walked down the hallway, those lifeless glass orbs shining behind the crystal pane. I tried to brush it off. I told myself I was just imagining things because of the unnerving expression on that porcelain face. Then something new started happening. If I so much as hummed a tune under my breath, I'd hear a faint click from the cabinet, as though the doll's head moved to follow the melody. I tested it with a friend who came to visit. One evening, he hummed a snippet of an old song, half joking that my creepy doll might enjoy some music. I pretended to laugh along, but inside my heart pounded. Then I heard a small, almost imperceptible crack in the doll's porcelain neck, the sound of it pivoting to align with him. The cabinet light shone even though he stood a good 5 feet away. My friend didn't notice, but the dull ache in my gut told me this was no coincidence. Later that night, a sense of unease kept me from sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I envisioned those glass pupils shifting on their own. I pictured that green dress swaying softly, the doll turning to stare at me with a silent admonition. My body was tense, my heart thudding so loudly I wondered if the neighbors could hear it when I finally drifted off. I dreamt that the display cabinet door opened on its own. I dreamt of faint, deliberate footfalls stepping out into my hallway. But worse than the footsteps was the image I got of the doll crawling onto my bed, its porcelain limbs scraping against the mattress. That dream left me with a clammy film of sweat clinging to my forehead. By morning, I tried to banish my fears by confronting them. Logically, the next day I set a radio near the cabinet and turned the volume low. I switched stations rapidly from classical to talk shows to static-laden channels. Each time a different melody or voice popped up, I detected an impossibly sharp snap coming from inside the glass. The doll was twisting its head to face the radio, the porcelain joints cracking like stiff bones. After the fifth switch, I had to turn the radio off. My pulse was thundering in my ears and my hands were damp with sweat. I couldn't decide if I was losing my mind or if something truly unearthly was happening in my own home that evening. The sensor light activated on its own about 4 times in the span of an hour. Each time my eyes would dart toward the cabinet, though the doll remained perched on its little stand. It never quite seemed to be in the same position. I remembered its posture was subtly altered. Maybe the head tilted at a slightly different angle, or the arm shifted in an almost imperceptible way. I convinced myself it was just my frazzled perception messing with me, but the tension in the house was suffocating, and I found it hard to swallow, as if my throat was constricted by the intangible fear settling in every corner. By the third night of this bizarre dance with the doll, my paranoia grew to the point where I could hardly bear to walk past the cabinet at all. I began taking detours around my own home to avoid that hallway. Each time I was forced to pass by, my pulse would spike, and I'd have to remind myself to breathe. My breath would become shallow and my chest would tighten. The air felt stale, as though no fresh breeze had crossed the threshold in years. I was convinced someone or something was watching me from inside the glass. If I lingered a second too long, I'd see my own reflection in the cabinet door, and it unsettled me how my eyes seemed more sunken than usual. Wide with fear, part of me couldn't believe I was letting a mere object rattle my nerves. So completely, another part of me recognized that something genuinely inexplicable was happening, and ignoring it might only make things worse. That's when I decided to test a theory. If the cabinet light and the doll's movements were triggered by any source of sound or melody, then maybe depriving the house of power would offer me some measure of control. I cut the power to my entire home. Late one afternoon, flipped the breakers, no electricity coursing anywhere. The refrigerator would keep things cool for a while. So I wasn't too worried. The house plunged into a soft gloom. Pale evening light filtered through the windows, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Without the usual hum of the appliances, the silence pressed on my eardrums. It felt as if I had stepped into some oppressive bubble where time had slowed to a standstill. Then I began to hum a low, trembling melody, the kind of tune that feels more like a frightened whisper than a song. It occurred to me how bizarre this was: a grown man standing in the dark, provoking a porcelain doll. The rational side of me insisted I was being ridiculous, but the fear in my stomach was more real than any denial I could muster. My voice quivered as I continued humming, sweat already pooling on my temples. That's when I heard it, a sickening crack, like the sound of bones snapping under pressure. The cabinet's interior light flared up, though the house had no power, except this time the glow was an ominous red bathing. The glass in a sinister hue. My pulse rocketed. I could practically feel the blood drain from my face. The doll's head swiveled, following the melody as I held my breath. My eyes darted to the glass doors and I caught my reflection. Only it didn't match my actual face. My reflection's mouth was sewn shut with thick green thread, just like the doll's dress. My lungs constricted and I could feel my fingernails biting into my palms. My reflection's eyes stared back at me in abject terror, but I couldn't blink. I was too entranced by what I was seeing. It lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then the red glow snapped off, plunging the cabinet back into darkness. My reflection was gone. My mouth was free of any thread. Yet I could taste a metallic tang like copper on my tongue. Shaking, I fumbled for a flashlight. My heart hammered so fiercely I thought it might burst, and my throat felt tight as though invisible fingers were pressing in on it. When my flashlight beam found the doll, it looked entirely unchanged, yet I couldn't ignore the darkness in its glassy eyes, as if something ancient and malevolent peered out through them. I spent the rest of that night pacing the living room, refusing to go near the hallway. A nauseating fear churned in my stomach, and each time I thought about that reflection, a wave of goosebumps prickled my arms. The worst part was the creeping sense that I wasn't alone. I kept feeling a presence hovering just outside my field of vision. Every time I spun around, the air behind me was empty. Still, my instincts screamed that something moved, darting from corner to corner, watching me with silent, predatory interest. My appetite vanished. Even sipping water felt laborious. The dryness in my mouth was unrelenting, and I could hear my own swallow echo in the hush. My legs twitched involuntarily, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. At one point, I thought I heard the cabinet door cack open. A soft shift of glass on hinges. I froze, sweat trickling down my temples, breath lodged in my throat. The only other sound was the rapid thumping of my heart. Eventually, I mustered the courage to tiptoe down the hallway, flashlight trembling in my hand. The cabinet door was closed, but that didn't console me. I had heard something. At least I believed I had dread escalated into full-blown paranoia by midnight. I wondered if I might be losing my mind. Maybe none of this was real. Maybe I was experiencing some kind of psychological break. But another part of me recalled the vendor's unwavering stare, that raw feeling of inevitability I had when I first picked up the doll. One thought echoed. In my head, I had invited this into my home. By the time dawn arrived, my nerves were so afraid I decided I had to either confront the doll or leave. But I couldn't stand the idea of fleeing my own house, so I resolved to face it with quivering hands. I switched the power back on. The normal lights buzzed faintly, and the refrigerator kicked into its routine hum, restoring some sense of the mundane. Taking a deep breath, I steadied myself and walked to the cabinet. My plan was to remove the doll from its place, wrap it in cloth, and lock it away. Somewhere inaccessible. Maybe I'd drive it to a storage unit across town. Maybe I'd bury it in the ground. I hadn't decided yet. I just knew it had to go. I opened the cabinet door slowly, the glass making a soft whoosh as it separated from the frame. The doll stared ahead, unblinking. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart was going so fast that I could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears. I reached in, cautiously, half expecting the doll to move on its own. My fingertips brushed the moss-green dress. The fabric felt rough, almost prickly. An intense wave of cold radiated through my fingers the moment I touched it. Forcing me to jerk back, it felt like plunging my hand into an ice bath undeterred. I tried again this time, pulling the doll out of the cabinet. It sat limp in my grasp, its limbs limp, but oddly heavier, as if resisting. The porcelain felt unnaturally cool, and I struggled to maintain a grip because my palms were slick with sweat. I wrapped the doll in an old blanket and placed it into a cardboard box. Each time the blanket's fold shifted, I caught a glimpse of those glass eyes, and a jolt of dread coursed through me. Once it was secured, I sealed the box with duct tape, creating multiple layers as if trying to hold back some malevolent power. My breath was ragged, and I could almost feel my heart pulsing in my throat. That evening, I drove the box to a storage facility on the outskirts of town. The entire ride, I kept the radio off, too afraid of what might happen. If a tune spilled out of the speakers, my hands were slippery on the steering wheel, and I stayed hyper-aware of every little noise the car made, half expecting the box to shuffle or the doll to whisper. My neck muscles were bunched up tense from the anxiety gnawing at me. Each red traffic light felt like an eternity, the shadows of passing cars stretching across my windows in unsettling shapes. Once at the storage facility, I rented a small unit. The place was dimly lit, the overhead fluorescents flickering every few seconds. My gut churned as I set the box down, but the overwhelming sensation was relief locking. That padlock felt like sealing away a fragment of nightmare. I told myself it was over, that the doll would remain there powerless. Yet my relief was cut by the persistent question, had I truly escaped? I wish I could say the story ended there, but even after I returned home, I found the hallway felt claustrophobic, as though the walls had inched closer. The display cabinet stood empty and dark, yet the space was still suffused with that same unsettling hush. At night, I occasionally heard the distinct click of the motion sensor light, as though it flicked on for just a second and then died out. Each time it happened, a burst of panic surged through me. I would lie still in my bed, covers drawn up to my chin, a cold sweat dampening my pillow. In those moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere behind that locked door in the storage facility, the doll was still listening. Still waiting. Worst of all are the reflections. Though my mirror reveals no threads across my mouth and my glass cabinet is empty, I sometimes catch a glimpse of my reflection in a dark window. In that fleeting glance, I swear my lips appear bound by green stitching. My throat locks up and my skin crawls with the memory of that red light. Every beat of my heart hammers home the realization that this encounter has left a permanent mark on me. I didn't destroy the doll. I merely confined it. For all I know, it can exert its influence from afar even now whenever a stray melody passes my lips. I pause, listening for that telltale crack of porcelain. I can never be entirely sure I won't hear it. I still struggle to sleep through the night without trembling awake. Convinced I heard the sound of a small figure moving under the bed, the gloom that has fallen upon my home weighs me down. An ever-present reminder of what's out there in that storage unit. There are nights I toy with the idea of retrieving the box, of burning the doll to ash, but I can't bring myself to do it. A nagging dread whispers that destroying it might invite something worse, so I remain here in a house that feels both mine and not mine, captive to shadows in the corners and faint flickers of light that dance across my walls. Every day I fight the creeping sensation that I'm never truly alone. I've managed for now to outrun the presence that haunted my hallway, but the scars linger in my psyche, reminding me that there are forces we can't easily comprehend, and that sometimes curiosity is more than just a weakness. It's an invitation. I remain poised in the hush of my own living room, eyes darting toward the hallway, ears straining for any hint of motion. The line between reality and nightmare has blurred, and I'm left with the haunting certainty that the doll's gaze may yet pierce the silence again. Nothing has died here. No child's laugh has echoed. No final heartbeat stilled, but a different kind of horror has taken root. A silent dread that prowls the edges of my life. And whenever I see my own reflection in the corner of my eye, I wonder if my lips will be free or stitched tightly shut in a vision of Green Thread Story 8. A low hum filled the bathroom the moment I first switched on the new overhead light, a faint buzzing that reminded me of an electrical short or distant static. It made the corners of my vision flicker, as if shadows clung to the walls and floor just beyond where the light could reach. That sense of a presence lurking right outside my field of view hit me with an unexpected force of foreboding, and I felt an instant urge to glance over my shoulder. The mirror was brand new, tall, sleek, spanning nearly the full length of one wall. Something about its polished surface, shining too brightly, unsettled me. It felt like a window to somewhere else, as though someone on the other side was staring back. I'm not the type to jump at every creaking floorboard or breeze rattling the shutters, but this mirror was different from the start. Every time I stepped onto the tiled floor and caught my own reflection under that harsh overhead light, a tingle shot through me. My breathing would go shallow, and I had to steel myself against a sudden chill on my neck. I dismissed it as the natural unease that comes from a big renovation. Stress can do strange things to one's mind. Yet it wasn't just stress that made me shiver. Even then, I felt the mirrored surface pulling at me like a silent invitation to see something I shouldn't. It was about a week after I installed it that I truly began to notice her. The first morning it happened, I remember standing in front of the mirror towel around my waist, brushing my teeth. I caught a glimpse of movement behind me, only a flicker. At first, barely more than a suggestion of motion. When I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. The uneasy buzz in my ears got louder, and I felt my pulse spike with a sudden jolt of adrenaline, but there was nowhere for anyone to hide in that tiny space. I tried to reason that maybe it was my reflection, or the reflection of a reflection bouncing off the shower door. It almost worked until I realized I had seen a silhouette that did not match mine at all. My silhouette was broad, muscular around the shoulders with a short haircut. The shape behind me was slender, tall with an elegant pose that suggested a woman. I chalked it up to fatigue too many late nights the next morning. However, it happened again, and this time I could see her more clearly. She stood close behind me in the mirror, so close that if she had been real, I would have felt the brush of her arm. Her face was turned slightly away from me, half lost in shadow, but I noticed she wore a bow, a dark navy blue ribbon tied neatly around a length of hair. My heart hammered so hard I felt it in my fingertips. My throat went dry and a cold sweat broke out along my spine. Turning around, I found nothing but steam rising from the hot shower and the bare walls. Yet when I looked back at the mirror for just half a second, the reflection lingered as though the woman had not vanished. Then it blinked out. From that point on, each morning introduced a new layer of dread. I began to dread walking into my own bathroom. I started leaving the light off, flipping the switch only when absolutely necessary, as if darkness was safer. But every time I flicked the light on, I felt that presence. My hands trembled when I reached for the door knob and my breathing turned shallow. Often I would just see the faintest impression of that figure, a pair of slender arms, the outline of a torso, a glimmer of that damn bow in her hair. Always behind me, always adjusting the ribbon as if fussing over her reflection. Then if I turned the light off, the mirror would keep glowing with her image for a second longer, like the afterimage of a flashbulb behind my eyelids. One evening I confided this strange phenomenon to a friend over the phone. I avoided direct details, though. For fear of sounding completely unhinged, he told me it was most likely a trick of the mind, some reflection of a fixture or a curtain. He insisted that I just needed more sleep and to get out of the house more, maybe see a doctor. If the visions didn't fade, his well-meant reassurances only gave me a brief respite, because as soon as I hung up, I realized how truly alone I was in my house. Every corner seemed charged with anticipation. The light in the hallway flickered, how a heartbeat pounded in my ears. I avoided using the bathroom's overhead light, sticking to a small nightlight plugged into the outlet, as if that would drive away whatever waited behind the mirror's surface. A few days later, real bows began to appear on my bathroom floor, bows identical to the one I saw her wearing. I found the first one lying next to the sink, the dark blue ribbon neatly tied, exuding a sweet, cloying scent. Unlike any perfume I had ever encountered, something about that sugary fragrance made my stomach churn. I bent to pick it up, and the moment my fingers closed around the ribbon, a surge of numbness shot up my hand. My fingertips tingled, turning cold as though I had plunged them into ice water. My vision clouded, and for a split second I saw an ornate ballroom illuminated by golden lights, filled with couples gliding in perfect unison to distant, haunting music. It felt like the 1930s or some bygone era, elegant attire, polished floors, the echo of refined chatter. Then the image vanished, leaving me shivering and gasping for air in my drab bathroom. I convinced myself that I must have misplaced an old ribbon, or that perhaps a friend had left it there as a prank. But a new bow showed up the next day, and then another. The day after that, each had the same sweet perfume that made my head spin. The same silky texture, the same navy hue every time I touched one. The numbness and visions returned. The glimpses of that 1930s ballroom became more vivid, more detailed, as if I was recalling a memory that didn't belong to me. I'd see people dancing, hear the soft murmur of conversation, taste the swirling haze of perfume in the air. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest, and I would inhale sharply as if waking from a feverish dream. I found myself becoming more paranoid. My senses sharpened at every sound: a creaking pipe, a dripping faucet, a gust of wind against the window. I began to suspect that the mirror's reflection followed me beyond the bathroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd see that dark blue ribbon trailing around a hallway corner, or a flash of movement in the reflection on my phone screen. I would spin around feeling my nerves tighten like overdrawn wires, only to find empty space. I couldn't sleep well, jolting awake in the middle of the night with my pulse racing. The house felt too big, too quiet. My own breathing sounded too loud in the darkness, and I felt as though someone else was in the room watching, sweating, trembling. I would reach for the lamp on my bedside table, half expecting to find that woman from the mirror standing at the foot of my bed, but she never appeared outside that glass barrier. At least not yet. Each time I gathered enough courage to face the bathroom mirror, I could sense a tension in the air as if it thickened around me. My lungs drew tight. My mouth went dry when I mustered the nerve to look straight into the mirror. The woman's figure would flicker in and out of the reflection, always behind me. She seemed more detailed. Now I could see the shape of her face in partial profile, the subtle arch of an eyebrow and that elegant bow. Sometimes her lips would twitch into a half smile, and a wave of lightheadedness would wash over me. The tiny hairs on the back of my neck would rise. My skin prickled as though brushed by electricity after a week of this torture. I woke up one morning with a dull ache in my left wrist. My head felt heavy as though I had barely slept. Yet my bed was rumpled as if I had thrashed around all night. When I sat up, I noticed a band of dark blue tied around my wrist. It was exactly the kind of ribbon I'd been finding on the floor. My heart dropped. I pulled at the knot, but it was taut, constricting the blood flow. My fingers tingled and I felt my pulse pounding against the ribbon's grip. A wave of nausea hit me and I broke into a cold sweat. My hand shook as I managed to loosen the knot. When I finally got the bow off, I saw that the skin underneath was bruised, reddened in the exact shape of the ribbon. The mark looked almost like a brand, as if my flesh had somehow bonded with it. I felt as though I'd been claimed desperate for answers. I marched to the bathroom mirror again. I couldn't contain my panic. My breaths came in short bursts and my knees felt weak. The overhead light buzzed and flickered as it always did, throwing the room into a stuttering half-D darkness. When my reflection came into focus, I saw my own arm raised, wrist still red, but the actual movement was delayed by a fraction of a second. My eyes looked terrified and uncertain, yet behind that reflection she was there. Her form rose out of the murky darkness in the mirror, that sweet perfume thick on the air. She lifted her own slender arm, but it wasn't mirrored to mine. Instead, she held out her hand as if inviting me to dance. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. My whole body broke out in goosebumps and an invisible pressure seemed to squeeze the air from my lungs. The reflection persisted even when I switched off the bathroom light for a full heartbeat, maybe two. I could still see her smiling face in the glass. Then the darkness swallowed her. The sense of suffocation remained, and I had to step out of the bathroom to catch my breath. My skin felt clammy, my heart thudding so loudly in my ears that it blocked out all other sounds. I steadied myself against the hallway wall, feeling the cold plaster beneath my shaking hand. I told myself to stay rational, that I was not losing my mind, that there had to be a logical explanation for it all. But deep down, my instincts screamed. Otherwise, my nights became plagued by dreams of that 1930s ballroom. In these dreams, the floor was polished to a mirror sheen and couples drifted gracefully, all wearing dark blue accents or ribbons. I was always there, trapped in the corner, unable to move my feet properly. Forced to watch, sometimes a tall figure in a dark, elegant gown would approach me and I would see the glint of a navy bow in her hair. She would extend her hand and just before our fingers touched, I'd wake up gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. Each time I awoke, I caught the faintest whiff of that sweet perfume, as if the dream had seeped into reality as my anxiety escalated. I tried to cover the bathroom mirror duct tape cloth. Even a small sheet of plywood at one point, none of it stayed in the morning. I'd find the coverings in a heap on the floor as though they had been carefully removed each time I discovered them there. My stomach lurched. I recall pressing my ear to the mirror's surface, hearing nothing but my own frantic pulse echoing inside my head. Yet I couldn't shake the impression that somewhere on the other side faint music played. Eventually, I realized I had to confront this haunting one final morning with the overhead light flickering erratically and the familiar hum vibrating in my skull. I found myself staring once more at that cursed reflection. The woman stood behind me closer than ever, her features half shrouded in darkness, but her expression unmistakable. Her lips parted in what looked like delight. Her eyes narrowed as if in anticipation she reached out. But rather than tapping my shoulder, her hand seemed to pass through my reflection. All at once, the overhead light sputtered, dimming just enough that her image became sharper. Then the reflection changed. I saw only my arm raised to the side as though holding an invisible partner. She moved in unison, swirling behind me, that bow in her hair. Bobbing gracefully, my heart hammered so violently I could scarcely breathe. A cold, prickling sweat broke out across my forehead. I felt a force pulling at my wrist. The same one I'd found tied by the ribbon. The air felt heavier, thicker. My ears roared with the rush of blood and my vision blurred at the edges. Despite every instinct telling me to run, I remained rooted to the spot, compelled by a strange inertia. At that moment, the power went out entirely. The bathroom was plunged into pitch blackness. Yet in the darkness, I saw her smile, an eerie glimmer of teeth, and the suggestion of eyes fixed on me. My own reflection had vanished, replaced by a swirling mass of shadows. I heard a hushed whisper, almost a sound of fabric shifting on a dance floor. The sweet perfume enveloped me, filling my nostrils until I felt like choking. My stomach twisted in fear, and something else, an inexplicable pull and almost longing to follow her into that swirling darkness. I don't know what exactly happened next. All I recall is a wave of dizziness and a single blink of light, like a camera flash. When the power returned a minute or so later, I found myself alone. The bathroom mirror was intact, its surface reflecting only my trembling figure. My arm was lowered, the bruise from the ribbon was throbbing, but no new mark appeared. The woman was gone for a moment. I just stood there, hands braced against the sink chest, heaving tears burning at the corners of my eyes. Then I noticed something off. The sweet perfume was still lingering, thick and undeniable, yet there were no bows on the floor, no hints of ribbons or swirling illusions in the glass. I felt my limbs shaking uncontrollably. My breathing came in shallow gasps and my heart thumped like it was about to jump out of my rib cage. I touched my left wrist and winced at the raw pain. Though I could see no one in the mirror, I felt as if something or someone had left a presence on my skin. Now, days later, I still avoid that mirror as much as possible. I keep the overhead light off and rarely step foot in the bathroom except when absolutely necessary. Still, I can't shake the sense that she is there, waiting beyond the reflection, ready to continue the dance. If I let my guard down, sometimes I catch that fleeting shape in the mirror. Sometimes I sense her next to me as I wash my hands, bowing ever so slightly in the watery reflection. And every so often, a stray navy bow appears somewhere in the house, on a windowsill beneath my pillow, on the staircase, filling me with dread and a trembling curiosity. I try not to touch them anymore. My fingers still ache from the last time I tried. I often wonder if I've been chosen or claimed by some spirit bound to that mirror, if the woman in the reflection is a specter from another time who sees me as her partner, or maybe it's all in my head, a product of mounting paranoia. Yet the physical evidence remains: the ribbons, the bruises, that nauseating perfume every day. I resist the temptation to smash the mirror, to rid myself of it once and for all. But some part of me worries that destroying it might only open a door, unleashing whatever stands on the other side. I don't believe I'll ever truly feel at ease in my own home again. Every time I see my reflection, I hold my breath, waiting for her face to emerge behind me. The real horror is that I've grown used to it. In a twisted way, fear has become my routine. My heart still pounds, my palms still sweat, but I no longer question whether I'm awake or dreaming. The woman is there, whether I want to acknowledge her or not. And sometimes late at night, when the house is silent except for the faint hum of electricity in the walls, I imagine I hear soft music drifting through the mirror. It calls to me like a distant memory of a grand dance floor, urging me to return. And as much as I dread it, a tiny part of me wonders what it would feel like to finally give in and let her lead me into the darkness. Story 9. Even now, I still taste the grit on my tongue, and every so often I catch a phantom scent of singed hair drifting through my memory at night. When I lie awake in the dark, I can almost feel the weight of an unseen presence leaning in. Close listening to my panicked breaths, that feeling never quite disappears. It clings to me like the damp chill that seeped into my bones. During my last weekend at my uncle's watchtower, I thought I knew what fear felt like before, but that trip made my heart pound in ways I didn't think possible. I felt my every nerve straining, expecting something terrible around every corner, and perhaps worst of all, I was forced to question the boundaries of reality, wondering if my mind had finally betrayed me, or if something unspeakable truly lurked in that dilapidated tower. I always considered my uncle's old property an oddity, even when I was younger, but there was a strange charm to it. A vast countryside with rolling fields, a weather-beaten barn, and that watchtower looming over everything. The structure itself was built in the 1970s, complete with a rickety spiral staircase and a massive analog TV perched up top. My uncle had rigged that television in a way that baffled me. He claimed it helped him monitor the cattle, some contraption of cameras and signals that let him watch over the pastures in real time. It was like stepping back in time when I visited with a static-laced image, crackling and ghostly lights dancing across the screen. I never thought twice about it until a few months ago when the television started turning itself on every night at exactly 11 o'clock. I remember the first time it happened. I was alone in that musty tower reading by a flickering lantern. The sudden burst of static made me jump. My pulse throbbed in my ears and I flicked off my lantern in an instinctual reaction. Startled by the TV coming to life on its own, the screen glowed a pale green that sent dancing shadows across the walls. And then came the strangest part. The news broadcast, it wasn't some vintage rerun, but a crisp program announcing events that hadn't happened yet. Lottery numbers, small town accidents, details about upcoming events. I was immediately unsettled. There was a half second where I rationalized it as some glitch or a bizarre coincidence. But then I saw the date. It was plainly typed at the bottom of the screen. 3 days in the future. At first I tried ignoring it. My hands were shaking as I debated what to do. The remote was nowhere to be found, so I went for the plug the instant I pulled the cord. The screen inverted into a negative image, and there I was, bright and distorted, crouched in front of the TV. It showed me staring right back, covered in mud. Up to my neck, eyes half shut and sunken in the hair on my arm stood up and a chill shot down my spine. I shoved the plug back in reflexively as though that could make the eerie vision vanish. The broadcast resumed, now describing in chilling detail a minor road collision that, according to the text scrolling across the screen, would happen on a weekday afternoon. I remember swallowing hard, a bitter taste of panic rising in my throat. I almost bolted out of the tower right then, but my curiosity and stubbornness got the better of me. That was just the start each time I visited at precisely 11 at night. The TV would snap on the newscaster, would calmly report future headlines, some about freak accidents, others about trivial community announcements or lottery results. Nothing too catastrophic, yet always phrased with an eerie certainty. My fear grew along with my fascination. I started keeping notebooks. I'd jot down lottery numbers, check the news in town, verify events when even the little details turned out to be accurate. I felt my heart race with each confirmation. My palms would sweat as I realized I was glimpsing days ahead of reality, and I had no logical explanation. My uncle, when I asked him about it in a roundabout way, just shrugged and mentioned he'd never seen such a thing, then asked if I was getting enough sleep. I avoided telling him everything. I didn't want him thinking I'd lost my mind. Instead, I told him the TV was acting up and he suggested I bring a new cable or maybe replace a fuse. At no point did he seem surprised, which disturbed me more. Maybe he knew something that he wasn't sharing, or maybe he truly had no idea. In any case, I was left alone to deal with it. Each night in that tower, my heart would pound whenever the clock neared 11. Sometimes I tried to stay downstairs, but I would hear a faint click and the hum of the screen flickering to life, drawing me back in like a moth to a flame. Last Sunday was when everything escalated to a point I could no longer handle. That evening, the sky was bruised with deep gray clouds and the air smelled like an oncoming storm. My entire body felt tense as I climbed the spiral staircase to the tower room. I was dreading the moment the TV would spark to life again. The wind rattled the windows and faint squeaks echoed in the old beams overhead, making me feel as though I was being watched from every corner. Sure enough, at 11 sharp, the screen lit up. This time the newscaster's voice was calm, almost soothing in its droning tone. I found myself leaning forward despite my better judgment, my heart thudding in my chest. Then the banner appeared at the bottom. Breaking news barn fire 3:18 a.m. My stomach dropped as the image on the screen switched to shaky footage of flames. It looked like the very barn on my uncle's property. My breathing grew rapid and shallow. I could feel beads of sweat forming on my forehead. According to the telecast, this fire would happen that very night. Well, 3 days in the future from the broadcast perspective, but for me it was only hours away. I tried to calm myself, but my thoughts sped in circles. I remember clenching my fists until my nails dug into my palms, desperate to figure out if this was some trick or a terrible omen. Midnight passed with agonizing slowness. My muscles tensed with every creak in the tower. The walls felt too close, as though the room were shrinking around me. I found it hard to breathe, and the air ryer of stale dust and something foul almost like wet fur. The temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath in front of me, and my heart pounded so hard it reverberated in my ears. I forced myself to sit there checking the time, every few seconds growing increasingly anxious as 3 a.m. approached, finally unable to contain my unease. I stormed down the staircase into the yard. At first, everything was eerily calm. The night was quiet except for the faint rustling of wind through dry grass. Then at 3:17, something changed. The barn seemed to glow from within as if bathed in an unnatural light. I thought I smelled smoke and my lungs constricted. My hair stood on end the next moment. An intense wave of heat assaulted me as if I'd stepped right into the mouth of a roaring furnace, but I saw no flames. My heart thundered and I instinctively raised my arms to shield my face from heat that shouldn't have been there. My eyes watered and I gasped for air. A swirling panic took hold of me and sweat rolled down my back. The barn remained intact, yet it felt like I stood mere feet from a raging inferno. Suddenly, a chorus of frantic lowing cows bellowing in distress echoed across the field. Except it didn't come from the barn, it came from the tower behind me. That single illogical detail made my blood run cold. My stomach churned as I whirled around. The tower windows were dark, but the unmistakable sounds of terrified cattle reverberated from inside. I tried to swallow, but my mouth had gone bone dry. My heart pounded so hard I felt dizzy and my legs threatened to buckle beneath me overhead. The night sky flickered with distant lightning illuminating the watchtower in brief strobe-like flashes. I stood there stunned, listening to the impossible. When I worked up the courage to move, I sprinted back into the tower, determined to silence that horrifying sound inside. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my legs burned with lactic acid, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples. The mooing had stopped by the time I reached the top, and the sudden silence was even worse. It felt like the walls were absorbing all sound, leaving me alone with the drumbeat of my own heart as I approached the TV. I smelled something acrid. The screen was still glowing faintly, flickering with white noise. Then out of nowhere, the image of the newscaster reappeared, face contorted by static. There was no sound, just the faint hum of static. My spine tingled and I took a step back, nearly ripping over a loose floorboard. Without warning, the TV let out a loud pop, and the screen went dark. An overpowering stench of burned electronics and singed hair filled the small room. My eyes watered, and I covered my nose and mouth, fighting back a wave of nausea. The television set crackled one last time as if letting out a dying breath, then exhaled a thin wisp of smoke into the air. A profound sense of dread clutched at my chest. Though I felt a shred of relief that the infernal broadcast had finally died, yet it was too soon to celebrate the second I turned to leave. I noticed a damp, muddy footprint on the floor. It was shaped like a boot print. my boot size leading away from the TV toward the narrow window on the north side of the tower. My stomach flipped. I lifted my own foot to compare, and though the shape matched my boots were clean and dry, I followed the muddy prints across the room. Each step more ominous than the last, they stopped at the window where the glass had been smeared with what looked like brown sludge. From the outside, my heart hammered as I tried to process the implication that something or someone had manifested footprints, as if I had been trudging through sticky mud trying to regain composure. I leaned against the wall, panting sweat dripping down my face. The swirl of fear and confusion made my head spin. I could still feel an undercurrent of heat in the air, though the barn outside looked quiet and dark again. My body trembled from exhaustion and fear. The scalding wave I'd experienced near the barn and the bizarre vision of negative images on the TV felt like fragments of a nightmare. I might have suspected I was sleepwalking if not for the pungent smell of burnt hair still assaulting my nostrils. Desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the tower, I rushed downstairs, my lungs heaved with each breath, and my hands trembled so badly that I had trouble unbolting the heavy tower door outside. The night air felt unnaturally still, but at least I could breathe. I stood there letting the soft breeze cool the sweat on my skin. There was no hint of smoke, no crackle of embers. The barn stood silently in the moonlight, its old timbers untouched. My heart rate gradually slowed, but I remained jumpy. Flinching at every rustle in the grass, I finally retreated to my truck. My uncle's house was just a few miles away, but I didn't bother going there. I couldn't bear to explain what had just happened, or maybe I simply lacked the courage to confront the possibility that he might confirm my worst fears or dismiss me entirely. Instead, I ended up behind the wheel engine, idling while I tried to steady my breathing for a moment. I considered driving straight home, leaving the farmland behind for good, but something told me I needed to close the loop, make sure the barn wouldn't suddenly burst into real flames once I was gone, so I waited minutes past in painfully slow increments. Each second thick with tension, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The air inside the truck felt heavier than the humid night. Outside, my eyelids began to sag from adrenaline crash, but I kept forcing myself to stay awake to watch the barn. In case those invisible embers reignited by dawn, nothing had changed. The horizon glowed with a hazy orange and the farmland looked peaceful again. No flickers of supernatural fire, no frantic mooing echoing from strange places. I finally allowed myself to drive away, convinced that I had to leave. Before my mind unraveled further in my rearview mirror, the watchtower receded into the distance, silent and brooding. I shuddered, remembering the negative image of my mud-drenched form on the TV screen. A few days have passed since then, and I'm still jumpy in my own apartment. The slightest noise, a creak of the floor. The static burst of a faulty radio makes my heart thump uncomfortably. My throat goes dry every time I think about that distorted broadcast, the acrid smell of burned plastic, and those impossible footprints. I'm half afraid I'll glance at my own reflection one day and see mud caked to my shoulders, the same vacant eyes I saw in that negative image. I haven't told my uncle all the details, only that I left early due to some urgent errands. Part of me suspects he already knows that something deeply wrong resides in that old watchtower. Perhaps he once saw the same phenomenon and chose to ignore it, or he's simply too used to the bizarre to question it. Either way, the final moments in that tower have shaken me to my core. Now late at night, I catch myself peering at my phone's clock when it's near 11. My pulse quickens. I wonder if somewhere on that deserted farmland the old analog TV tries to flicker back to life, broadcasting future tragedies or impossible illusions. And I wonder if in those transmissions my face might still appear sinking into dark, slimy earth. The thought alone is enough to make me break into a cold sweat. My hands tremble and my heartbeat resonates in my skull. Every so often I replay that final night, searching for an explanation that will make it all less horrifying. No explanation comes. I'm left with the memory of that scorching heat and the echo of distressed mooing in a place. It had no business being the watchtower may still be standing silent for now, but heavy with secrets waiting to resurface. I doubt I'll ever feel at ease again. Not with the knowledge that some boundaries of nature were twisted in front of me like a cheap illusion. The terror I felt that night lingers in the corners of my mind, impossible to brush away. And so I stay far from that tower, yet in my dreams I still see its silhouette against a lightning-streaked sky. I smell the burning inside the cramped room, feel the muddy floor under my feet, and see the flicker of a news anchor predicting events that haven't yet unfolded. I don't sleep well anymore some nights. As the clock ticks toward 11, I jerk awake, heart-hammering, convinced I hear static emanating from a distant television. I stare into the darkness, trying to slow my breathing, uncertain whether something waits for me in that farmland or if my own mind has become the real prison. Either way, the sense of impending dread remains an invisible bond tying me to that tower, reminding me there are forces at play I may never fully understand or escape. Story 10, the air in the Victorian studio felt stale from the moment I stepped inside, as though something thick and ancient clung to the walls. The corridor leading to the main room smelled of dust and faint mold, and every footstep I took seemed to echo longer than it should. It was late afternoon when I arrived, but the dying light through the tall, narrow windows did little to chase away the shadows pooling in the corners. My heart was already pulsing a bit faster than usual, unsettled by the atmosphere but trying to brush it off. As travel fatigue, I had rented this place for a 3-day conference. I was organizing thinking the lavish Victorian design would impress potential clients. The listing photos showed ornate wallpaper, heavy drapes, and a grand display cabinet filled with porcelain dolls. An odd touch I assumed would be a quirky conversation starter. In reality, the place felt more like a museum frozen in time. The caretaker had led me in briefly, but left soon after, handing me a thick guest book and pointing out the main features inside the main room. That display cabinet immediately grabbed my attention. It stood about 7 feet tall against the far wall, locked tight with a small brass keyhole behind the glass. 20 porcelain dolls in frilly dresses and elaborate hats stared outward, their painted eyes strangely reflective in the dimness. I'm not someone who scares easily, but there was something about those dolls so perfectly still, yet each with a delicate expression that seemed to shift whenever I glanced away, that made my spine tingle. I chalked it up to nerves about the conference. The first day went by in a rush of setting up. I stayed in the studio alone that night, double-checking the equipment for presentations. Although the day had been filled with normal tasks, arranging chairs, testing audio, greeting a few early arrivals, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched once. While I was adjusting the projector in the main room, I swore I heard a faint tapping on glass. I paused, heart thumping against my ribs, listening, but it never repeated. I thought it might be the old building settling or a branch scraping a window when I walked past the cabinet, though the doll seemed angled just a little differently than before. My breath caught, but I convinced myself that I must have bumped the display somehow, or that the caretaker had repositioned them during the second night. I finally shut everything off and got ready for bed. It was almost midnight, and the hallway light flickered as I headed to my small rented bedroom at the back of the studio. The bed was an antique four-poster with a headboard carved into swirling patterns that vaguely reminded me of twisted faces. The sheets were clean enough, but every time I moved, I heard the old wood creak with unsettling groans that made me think of hushed voices. My mind wouldn't settle, and my pulse drummed in my ears. Eventually, I dozed off. Sometime later, I was jolted awake by my phone vibrating. My room was pitch dark, the only light a vague glow from the phone screen. I squinted at the time, 3:06 a.m. A cold wave of anxiety washed over me. I have a meditation app that sometimes plays gentle ambient sounds, but I never leave it on yet. Here it was automatically launching itself, blasting some archaic French chanting through the tiny speaker. The voices were shrill and hollow, clashing and overlapping in a hypnotic hum, confused and still half asleep. I tried to pause or mute it, but my screen showed no signal and the on-screen controls were unresponsive. My heart pounded and I felt a cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. I managed to force close the app. Letting the room fall silent again for a few seconds, I listened for any explanation, maybe a random glitch or a known bug, but out in the corridor I heard a soft noise like sliding glass. It was such a distinct, careful sound that I jerked upright, blood thawing in my ears. I stepped out of bed, legs shaky, and crept toward the door. My mouth was dry, and when I tried to swallow, my throat felt raw. The corridor was drenched in darkness, so I fumbled for the light switch there. At the far end stood the display cabinet. My stomach dropped when I realized its glass door was slightly ajar, reflecting a thin strip of ghostly light from a wall sconce. My breathing quickened. That cabinet had been locked. I remember checking it on the first day because the caretaker insisted it must remain sealed. It definitely hadn't been opened before. I felt each beat of my heart hammering against my chest as I walked closer. The door squeaked softly when I nudged it inside. The cabinet was empty. All 20 porcelain dolls were missing before I could even process that shocking realization. I heard a slight shuffle from behind me near the direction of my bedroom. My entire body tensed, and I spun around. The faint overhead light revealed them. The dolls arranged in a loose semicircle on the floor around my bed. It was as if they had assembled for a quiet gathering. Their tiny porcelain bodies faced the mattress, and each head was tilted at an odd angle like a line of metronomes about to start ticking for a moment. I felt sure I was still dreaming, trapped in some kind of twisted nightmare. My vision blurred and I had to blink hard. Stepping back, I felt my skin crawling, beads of sweat trickling down my temples. My legs wobbled and I nearly fell against the wall. Summoning every bit of courage, I reached for my phone. Wanting proof of what I was seeing, I opened the camera, but the feed on my screen didn't match the room instead of the wide shot I expected. All I saw were extreme close-ups of grinning porcelain mouths, the image zooming in and out in a rapid, dizzying fashion. No matter how I angled the phone, the display refused to show a normal perspective. It was as if the dolls themselves were controlling the camera's focus, forcing me to confront their tiny, unsettling smiles. One by one, adrenaline flooded my system. I could hardly breathe, each inhale ragged and shallow. The walls felt closer, as though they were shifting inward in a rush of panic. I dashed to the bed, sweeping the dolls aside with frantic swipes of my arms. They clattered to the floor, but did not break in the back of my mind. I heard the brittle impact of porcelain on wood, yet not a single doll chipped or cracked. My hands were trembling so hard I could barely keep my phone from slipping out of my grip. Staggering back, I slammed the bedroom door shut, as if that could contain whatever force was animating those grotesque figures. I don't know how long I stayed awake. Lights on back pressed against the headboard. Panting minutes felt like hours. My heart never seemed to slow down. It was a frantic drumming metronome in my chest, mirroring the silent bobbing of those porcelain heads. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me when I woke. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, and I had to summon all my courage to peek around the bedroom door. The dolls were back in the cabinet, lined up neatly as though they'd never moved. The glass door was shut locked without the faintest sign of tampering. I almost convinced myself it was a hallucination. Stress can play tricks on the mind, especially in an unfamiliar environment, but the memory felt far too vivid. Every detail was etched into my thoughts. The archaic chanting, the camera's bizarre glitch, the doll's unnerving presence. I decided I would leave that day. It was supposed to be my final day hosting any lingering business. But I resolved to cut it short. I called the caretaker, or tried to explain. There was some malfunction in the cabinet lock, and that it terrified me. My phone had no signal again, even though it had worked fine earlier in the day. Anger and fear churned in my stomach as I realized I was essentially trapped with no easy way to report this. I forced myself to walk back to the main room, determined to gather my conference materials and meet any final visitors in a public cafe nearby. Instead, the place was silent, aside from the faint creaks of old floorboards. The dolls stared at me through the glass unchanged, but I felt their presence as a tangible weight in the air. My heart pounded, and a cold film of sweat coated my neck and underarms. I could practically taste the tension, metallic and bitter at the back of my throat. While clearing my notes from a side table, I heard that same archaic chanting from the phone speaker. My phone lit up from across the room on a chair, flickering as if stuck in a short loop. The chanting was louder than before, layered with overlapping voices. It sounded like a recording from a centuries-old ceremony. the French words archaic and elongated, almost a moan that curled at the edges of hearing. My pulse skyrocketed. I approached my phone slowly, dread building with every step. The screen displayed an indecipherable symbol, not an app icon, just a swirling pattern that pulsed with the chanting breathing heavily. I snatched the phone and tried to power it down. The button wouldn't respond. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Maybe everything around me was conspiring to unravel my mind. The chanting cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so thick it made my ears ring. Then, for no apparent reason, the phone rebooted, returning to its normal home screen with no sign of what had just happened. I rushed around collecting all my belongings, yanking cords from outlets and cramming them into my suitcase. My sweat-damp shirt stuck to my back, and every so often I'd catch a glimpse of those doll eyes reflecting the overhead lights. Even behind the glass, they felt too close. My body trembled with the tension of knowing that in this place the ordinary rules didn't seem to apply by the time I reached the front door. Early sunlight glowed outside, but it was far too weak to feel comforting. The caretaker had instructed me to check out in person, but I wasn't sure I'd be able to find her in the rambling estate. I was ready to leave the key on a table and never look back yet. I found her in the foyer wearing a polite expression that seemed disconnected from the building's oppressive aura. She gestured casually toward the guest book which lay open on a wooden podium through clenched teeth. I admitted I hadn't filled out the guest book. The caretaker mumbled that the property owner strongly preferred every guest do. So she mentioned in a distant tone that the cabinet's lock had a persistent glitch. It sometimes unlocked on its own if the guest refused to write an entry. My breath caught in my throat instantly. The sensations of last night glass sliding the dolls clustering around my bed surged back, sending adrenaline spikes into my bloodstream. I could barely maintain composure. My heart hammered and I felt my palms sweating as I struggled to handle the keys. She seemed to sense my agitation but didn't press. She simply repeated that it was an unfortunate defect. I scribbled a few forced sentences in the guest book. My mind, too, frazzled to think straight. It felt like completing some archaic ritual rather than a polite practice. My signature looked shaky and my pen nearly slipped from my sweaty grip as I wrote. A single porcelain doll seemed to peer at me from the main room entrance. Though I couldn't be certain in my peripheral vision, the caretaker thanked me, her voice calm and measured. I managed to nod a wave of dizziness crashing over me. I bolted outside without another word, my suitcase banging against the old wooden steps. The instant the door closed behind me, I felt like I could breathe again. The morning air was crisp and it tasted of freedom, but the memory of that chanting still buzzed in my ears. My heart was pounding so fiercely that I had to lean against my car for a moment before I could steady my shaking hands enough to find my keys driving away. The distance from the studio felt surreal, as if I were escaping some hidden realm, rather than just a piece of real estate. Every bump in the road made me jump, and every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see one of those porcelain faces staring at me from the back seat. But the car was empty, no chanting, no mechanical glitch on my phone. Eventually, the normal world swallowed me up again with its traffic lights and convenience stores, a jarring contrast to that suffocating edifice of Victorian finery and strange phenomena. Yet even now my hands get clammy when I recall the moment I realized all 20 dolls had found their way out of the cabinet. I still feel that prickle on the back of my neck, the sensation that a silent crowd is gathering just beyond my field of vision. Sometimes I wake at 3:06 a.m. with my heart pounding, expecting to hear that haunting French chanting or see a reflection of a porcelain grin in the dark. I never did submit my review of that place online. Despite the caretaker's request, something in me recoils at the idea of revisiting the memory in such a public forum, as if speaking too openly about it could reignite whatever force lurked behind those painted eyes. Rationally, I tell myself it must have been some elaborate prank or a bizarre glitch in the building's wiring. But late at night, logic doesn't stand a chance against the pounding of my heart and the creeping dread that those dolls aren't merely lifeless collectibles. In the end, I escaped without any physical harm, but I can't quite shake the feeling of having brushed up against something beyond my comprehension. The caretaker's serene explanation about the lock's defect left me more disturbed than any hysterical apology could have. It was as though this phenomenon was not a malfunction but an expected quirk of the house itself, a test of sorts that I had unknowingly failed by not writing in the guest book quickly enough, even though I'm safe. There's a lingering unease inside me as if some part of that Victorian studio clings to my psyche. I see porcelain dolls in store windows now and feel my breath catch when I close my eyes. In the deep hours of the night, I sometimes envision them crowding around my bed, heads tilting in unison, mouths forever stretched in those cryptic smiles. No matter how many days or nights pass, I'll never forget the disembodied chanting or the sensation of sliding glass at an hour when no one else was awake. I told myself I'd never speak of this again, but I also can't stop the nightmares. Perhaps I could have avoided it all by simply scribbling in that guest book right after I arrived, but I hesitated. And in that hesitation, something slipped free in the old Victorian studio, a presence that witnessed my refusal and responded in kind. I keep my phone on silent at night. Now just in case, and when 3:06 a.m. rolls around I can still feel my heart racing like a drumbeat echoing through a dark corridor summoning that eerie chanting from the threshold of memory. Even months later a sense of being watched clings to me, a private haunting that offers no closure. I think that's the true horror. Not the sight of the dolls moving or the cryptic apology at checkout, but the persistent weight of the unknown that follows me like a shadow I can't outrun. It stands behind every glance in the mirror. It rustles in every late night silence, and it reminds me that sometimes in places too old for our modern comforts, there are forces that exist beyond doors, behind glass cabinets waiting to be acknowledged or to punish those who refuse. Story 11, I remember the first time the television flickered to life on its own. It was exactly 10 p.m. and the living room lights were off, except for the bluish glow of the standby LED. I had always slept with the TV on. No signal, mostly because I found the faint static oddly comforting. It lulled me into a drowsy state, making my studio apartment feel less lonely. But that night, the soothing hiss suddenly transformed into something so loud it felt like a burst of thunder in my ears. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribcage, sweat instantly breaking out across my forehead. I stared at the screen, which was no longer showing static, but rather some grainy footage of an empty street, one I vaguely recognized but couldn't quite name. That's how it all began, an unsettling routine that would transform my life into an unrelenting nightmare. I live in a city where all the streets seem identical. At night, they're lined with repetitive storefronts, old lampposts, and flickering neon signs that could pass for each other from block to block. The footage on my TV that evening was so mundane that I might have dismissed it as some random broadcast glitch, if not for the unmistakable arrangement of a particular stop sign at an oddly steep angle a few days later during my morning commute. I walked by that exact street. The stop sign was bent in precisely the same way my stomach lurched, as if I had missed a step descending a staircase. I felt a wave of vertigo, and for a moment I thought I was about to pass out. The air felt too thick to breathe, and my heart pounded as though it might burst. I remember gripping a lamppost to steady myself while I tried to rationalize what I had seen by the following week. The TV had developed a mind of its own every night at 10 p.m. Sharp, the volume would crank itself to a deafening level, and a new location would appear on the screen. Each scene was more unsettling than the last familiar crosswalks, corner stores I frequented, even back alleys I passed on my way to work, all displayed with harsh lighting and ominous emptiness. At first I thought it might be some twisted prank, maybe a hidden camera feed from an unknown source. But each time I tried to track down the signals on my TV's menu, I found no channels registered. It was always set to the standard, no signal input. Everything in me told me to stop watching, to move out, or maybe to smash the cursed device to pieces. Yet inexplicably, I stayed. I told myself it would sort itself out, or perhaps I was too afraid to confront whatever was behind it. Part of me refused to accept that this was something beyond the realm of electronics. I reached a breaking point a few weeks in after I dismantled the TV's motherboard in a desperate attempt to end the nightly broadcasts. I removed the back panel and unplugged every cable I could see, scattering screws all over the floor. In my frustration, when I stepped back, I realized I was panting, my hands trembling so hard I could barely grip the screwdriver. The entire apartment felt oppressively silent, as if the walls were holding their breath. I left the TV's disassembled innards in a heap, turned my back on it, and went to bed that night with a sense of triumph. Certain I had finally taken control, but at exactly 10 p.m., a searing light forced my eyes open. I felt my chest tighten as I realized the screen was lit again, blazing white against the darkness. The cables were still on the floor, yet it was on a sizzling static, poured from the speakers loud enough that I thought my eardrums might burst. My throat went dry and I tasted copper on my tongue, as if adrenaline had flooded my system so intensely I could taste fear itself. I rolled off the bed and skewered toward the living room legs, shaky from panic. When I peered into the screen, I saw not a street this time, but something else. There was a warped silhouette behind the flickering light, as if someone stood behind the glass, pressing forward like it was some flexible membrane. I saw the shadow of what appeared to be a man's arm, straining as though trying to push itself through the CRT tube. My entire body broke out in chills. I heard a faint scraping from the inside of the set, like nails on metal. In that moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind refused to process what my eyes were showing me. I felt a wave of nausea twist my stomach, and I barely managed to stay on my feet. After a few seconds, the figure receded and the screen went black. The silence that followed pounded in my ears, making every ticking second stretch into an eternity. The events escalated from there. Every time the clock struck 10 p.m., my television would flare to life, cycling through terrifying images. Sometimes it was a lonely parking lot I'd pass the next morning, where I'd notice the same cracks in the asphalt that had appeared on the screen. Other times it would show me unfamiliar corners of the city I'd later stumble upon by accident, but nothing compared to the night it displayed my own building. I stood transfixed as the grainy footage panned slowly up the external walls, capturing each window with eerie clarity. The camera angle was all wrong. It was as if someone was filming from above, maybe from a crane or rooftop across the street. My heart thudded so violently that I thought I might faint on the spot, and then it zoomed in on the seventh floor, my floor, and highlighted a solitary door with an arrow drawn in something that looked like red paint. It was my apartment. I felt my knees weaken and a cold sweat trickled down my back. Even though it was only an image on a screen, it felt like a direct threat. Something or someone telling me it knew exactly where I lived the next day at work. I tried to maintain composure. I avoided direct conversation with colleagues unless absolutely necessary, and even then I kept it curt. Inside, I was a spiral of anxiety. I could still see that arrow flashing on the door in my mind, accompanied by the echo of static. My manager asked if I was feeling all right. I only nodded and mumbled something vague about lack of sleep when I finally trudged home. My pulse quickened the closer I got to my building. My footsteps echoed on the pavement as night fell, blending with the hum of distant traffic. I half expected to see something horrifying in the lobby, a silhouette lurking behind the reception desk or the elevator opening by itself, but everything was mundane, almost insultingly normal. That is, until I reached my apartment door. It was ajar. My key trembled in my hand and I hesitated before stepping inside. My pulse throbbed in my ears and my breath turned shallow. The hallway beyond my door was dark, as if every light bulb in my apartment had decided to give out at once. I could smell something unusual in the air, an electrical odor mixed with stale, musty notes of dust. Immediately I reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. My heart was drumming in my chest so frantically it almost hurt. As I inched forward, I caught sight of the TV. It was flipped around its exposed tubes and wires facing outward, and the dark screen was turned to the wall. It was still plugged in, flickering faintly against the paint. My mind reeled. I knew I had left the set disassembled days ago, and the motherboard had been lying on my coffee table. Yet there it was, reassembled in this twisted position, as if someone or something wanted me to see it. From a new angle, I heard a faint buzzing from behind the screen, like static, traveling through live wires. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. It felt as if an unseen presence hovered in the darkness. My breathing grew ragged and I struggled to keep my composure. I reached out to touch the back of the CRT, but it was cold, shockingly cold. Like a block of ice, I felt a jolt of adrenaline surge through me, forcing my hand away. Then the screen flashed, illuminating the wall in front of it with the silhouette of that same humanoid figure. I watched paralyzed as the shadow pressed close, the glass bowing outward as if it were pliable. My chest tightened in a spasm of terror. I wanted to shout, but my voice refused to surface. The shape lingered, pressing with agonizing slowness. I could almost feel the pressure in the air as it attempted to breach the boundary between its world and mine. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The rest of that night was a haze of fear I sat in. A corner knees drawn up to my chest, eyes locked on the reverse television. My body shook with tremors that refused to subside, and beads of sweat traced down my temples. The entire apartment felt claustrophobic, as though the walls had inched closer in the silence. Every creak of the floor and distant rumble of a passing car made my heart lurch. Eventually, I convinced myself I had to move, that I couldn't just remain in that paralyzed state. My thoughts were erratic, veering between the possibility that I was losing my grip on reality and the dreadful notion that everything I had experienced was all too real. I rummaged for my phone, nearly dropping it from my sweaty grip. My instinct was to call someone, maybe the building manager or a friend, but the thought of explaining this situation made my mouth go dry. How does one describe the impossible? I gave up on the idea of a call and resolved to get out of the apartment. I fled that night to a cheap motel on the other side of town. The relief of being away from my place was immediate but incomplete. My sleep was tormented by half-remembered images of static and silhouettes. I woke up every hour heart pounding. Certain that I would see the TV in a corner of the motel room the next morning, I headed back to my apartment in broad daylight, telling myself that everything would appear less horrifying under the sun. The moment I stepped inside, I saw the TV was no longer reversed. It was in its usual spot. The cables still scattered on the floor exactly where I'd left them after dismantling it. The first time for a minute I doubted my own recollection of the previous night. Perhaps the fear had played tricks on me. Perhaps I had dreamed that I found it reassembled and facing the wall, yet that cloying smell of burnt dust still hung in the air, and a part of me knew I hadn't imagined it in a last-ditch effort. I dragged the set into the hallway, determined to discard it altogether. I had fantasies of hauling it to the dumpster behind the building, but the instant I tried to push it past my threshold, the screen flared to life again, showing me a live feed of my own corridor. My knees buckled and I stumbled backward on the screen. I saw myself standing in the hallway with my hands on the TV, eyes wide in shock. It felt like some impossible feedback loop, an image reflecting my exact position in real time. My body became as rigid as stone. Then the camera panned over my shoulder, revealing an empty corridor behind me. Yet in the real hallway, I was sure I sensed something right at my back. The adrenaline spike made my hands clammy and my heart hammered so fiercely I thought I might black out. I dropped my grip on the set and scrambled back into my apartment, slamming the door shut. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I felt a bizarre tingling sensation in my limbs as if they were losing circulation. It became clear to me that this entity, whether a manifestation of my own madness or something genuinely supernatural, did not want me to remove the television. Trapped, trembling, I leaned against the door, my mind churned with possibilities from the rational to the absurd, but each thought collided with the next. Leaving me disoriented and numb, the only certainty was that I felt watched, perpetually observed and vulnerable, determined not to let this thing dominate my life. I devised a plan. I would record the events on my phone, capturing any nightly anomalies, then show them to someone I trusted. But every time I tried to film the screen at 10 p.m., the camera on my phone would glitch, freezing with digital artifacts that made the footage useless. My phone would reboot on its own, erasing the file before I could view it. My nights became a cycle of fear and resignation. The images on the TV continued. More streets I'd see days later. More glimpses of the shadow man pushing against the glass, more ominous angles of my apartment building. I noticed that in each new broadcast, the perspective came closer as if it was slowly zeroing in on me. Finally, I reached a point where I had to make a choice, either abandon my apartment or face whatever was happening. I decided in a bout of desperate courage to confront the thing. On the following night, I sat down in front of the TV at 9:50 p.m., heart-racing sweat dampening the back of my neck. I focused on my breathing, determined not to run. 10 minutes later, the set crackled and roared to life. The volume was as loud as ever, and the picture was of a dimly lit corridor. The inside of my building approaching my door, I forced myself to watch, hands shaking uncontrollably. Step by step, the footage advanced until it was right outside my apartment. There was a moment of static, and then the silhouette appeared again, pressing forward from the inside of the screen, its hands stretching toward the glass. My chest tightened. My mouth felt parched and my lungs fought for air, but I didn't look away. For once I refused to recoil. I must have been trembling so hard my vision blurred, but I remained there staring. Then, everything went dark. Not just the TV. My entire apartment lost power. I was plunged into total darkness, the kind that makes you question if you've suddenly gone blind. My heart hammered in my ears and I braced myself, expecting some horrific touch or a whisper in the blackness. Instead, I heard a gentle hum of electricity returning and the lights flickered back on the TV was off the screen. Black and lifeless, just as it should have been. I waited chest heaving, expecting the worst, but all that greeted me was an unnerving silence. I don't know what changed in that moment, whether my refusal to flee broke whatever hold it had on me or if the entity simply decided it had toyed with me long enough. All I know is that after that night the television never turned on by itself again. I eventually disposed of it in broad daylight, hauling it piece by piece to an electronics recycling center. For the first time in weeks, I slept without the piercing dread of a sudden broadcast. The images of deserted streets and contorted silhouettes still haunt my dreams, and a static hiss can send my heart fluttering in an instant. But the nightly assault ceased to. This day I can't fully explain what happened. Sometimes I question whether it was all a slow descent into paranoia, maybe some psychological break from stress and isolation. Yet every time I walk by a location that once appeared on my screen, I'm struck by an unshakable certainty that something beyond understanding reached into my life. The residue of that terror remains. Every flicker of a street lamp can make me jump, and every faint hum of electrical equipment in a quiet room sends a chill through my bones. I feel as though I've touched the edge of something indescribable, and I can't help but sense it might be lingering somewhere, waiting to reclaim my attention. Even now, if I glance at a blank screen, I sometimes imagine I see a shadow behind the glass pressing forward, waiting for the right moment to break through. And despite my attempts to move on, I'm not entirely sure that moment won't come again. Story 12. The fluorescent kitchen light hummed with a cold, harsh glow, casting elongated shadows across the linoleum floor. I remember feeling my stomach clench the first time I turned it on at an ungodly hour, expecting to make a simple late-night snack. There was something off about the quiet at that hour, like the walls were holding their breath. The metallic taste of dread spread across my tongue before I even registered. Why, then I saw it leaning against the refrigerator, a flickering red shape as if illuminated by a distant fire. My heart lurched, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I blinked hard when I opened my eyes. The shape vanished, only the echo of crimson remained burned into my retinas like an afterimage that was the first night I live alone in a modest apartment. The kind of place with thin walls and squeaky floorboards where the simplest noise can take on a sinister edge. Past midnight, I used to appreciate my solitude. I enjoyed cooking late when everything was silent. No traffic outside, no footsteps in the hallway. Those were the moments I felt most at peace. Now every time I flip on the light in the kitchen, my pulse spikes because I know I might see that red silhouette again the second time it happened. My knees shook so intensely that I had to hold onto the counter for support. That time it appeared behind the fridge door. I caught its reflection on the handle, a dim, ember-like glow that pulsed in time with my panicked heartbeat. Then as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. I was left standing there panting, lated and drenched in cold sweat. Whenever this thing showed up, it left behind a clear sign of its presence. The magnets on the fridge would tumble off in random patterns. Sometimes the letter magnets spelled out nonsense. Other times numbers clattered onto the floor on one particular night. I stooped down to pick them up and I realized they formed coordinates. I typed them into my phone, immediately feeling a crawling sensation at the back of my neck. The primal awareness that I was being watched. Those coordinates pointed me to a cafe across town. I nearly dismissed it as some glitch in my mental state, perhaps the product of my overactive imagination, but something compelled me, some mix of curiosity and dread, to visit that location. The following afternoon, the cafe sat at the end of a narrow street. It had large windows that reflected the sky, making it look almost ethereal. As soon as I stepped inside, a wave of unease rolled through me. The place looked perfectly normal, a scattering of tables, chalkboard menu, and a faint smell of freshly ground coffee. Yet my stomach twisted with the same cold tension I felt in my kitchen at night. I noticed a faint chemical odor. It was so subtle I had to step closer to confirm it. Natural gas or something close. I questioned myself, wondering if anyone else smelled it. I considered mentioning it to an employee, but the sense of imminent dread made me hesitate. Instead, I told myself I might be imagining it. I left unsettled that night. I dreamed about the cafe in the dream. Everything was tinted a deep carmine. I walked in again only to see the entire interior engulfed in flames. There was no screaming or chaos, just walls of fire and that chemical smell. I woke with my heart hammering against my ribcage, drenched in perspiration. My ears rang as if I'd actually been inside a roaring blaze, shivering. I got up for a glass of water. The overhead light in my bedroom felt too bright, too accusatory, as if it were judging me for entertaining these fears. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to steady my breath. A dull throbbing started behind my eyes, and I couldn't decide if I was losing my mind or if I had stumbled onto something dangerously real. The following morning, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. It contained a receipt timestamped for a future date, indicating I had purchased a coffee from that same cafe at 2:17 p.m. The transaction total was circled in red ink. My heart skipped a beat. I checked the date. It was several days away. How could I have a receipt for a moment that hadn't happened yet? My first instinct was to tear it to pieces and pretend it never arrived, but the compulsion to know the truth burned in my gut. I pinned the receipt to my corkboard in the hallway, telling myself I'd decide later whether to confront that day head on or stay as far away from that cafe as humanly possible. That night I turned on the kitchen light with dread swirling in my chest. My spine tingled, anticipating the red silhouette it appeared again, pressing against the fridge door as though it were leaning into it, trying to listen. My breath caught in my throat as the bulbs flickered. Once the silhouette twisted and seemed to shift position, I felt my mouth go dry in the faint hum of the refrigerator motor. I thought I could hear a distant crackling like a fire raging just out of sight. My legs started trembling, sweat dribbled down my forehead, and I blinked rapidly to dispel the illusion. The figure disappeared, leaving behind a row of fridge magnets clattering to the floor in a suspicious pattern. Once again, they formed a sequence of letters and numbers. Another set of coordinates pointed me to the same cafe by the time the date on the receipt arrived. My nerves were on edge. I hadn't slept well in days, jerking awake after nightmares, feeling my chest tighten with dread. My appetite vanished. Every noise in my apartment, from the whining pipes to the creaking boards, put me on high alert. I was hyper-aware of my own heartbeat, a frantic pounding that refused to settle when the day finally came. I almost couldn't bring myself to leave the apartment. Part of me was convinced something catastrophic was about to happen at 2:17 p.m., just like my dream of the fiery explosion. Another part of me insisted I had to be there to learn the truth. I arrived at the cafe early and chose a table. Outside, the sky overhead was a dull gray, and a light breeze carried the faint smell of exhaust from passing cars. My anxiety spiked with every tick of the clock on my phone. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting to see a spark or flicker of red just beyond the threshold. I felt an odd pressure behind my eyes, and my lungs seemed to tighten as though the air was thinning. As 2:17 p.m. approached, my heart pounded so loudly I could practically hear it over the murmured conversations of strangers. Then right on cue, there was a sharp echoing noise from within the building like a pipe snapping. My entire body jerked in response and I braced myself, expecting an eruption of flames or a toxic smell of gas, but nothing happened. The noise subsided and the cafe patrons hardly noticed. I felt like I was about to pass out from sheer tension. My armpits prickled with sweat and my fingers twitched on the surface of the table. A surge of relief mixed with confusion left me dizzy. I forced myself to stand up, blood rushing from my head as I did. One of the employees inside peered out curiously, probably wondering why I looked so pale I couldn't muster the will to walk in and ask about the gas smell. I simply turned on my heel and stumbled back to my car, shaky and nauseous. That night I walked into my apartment with the uneasy realization that I had no closure, no answers. Perhaps the future receipt was a sign that I had changed events by refusing to go inside, or maybe I was never at risk in the first place. None of it made any sense. The taste of lingering dread coated my mouth, and I found myself consumed by the need to check the kitchen. There in the silence, I flicked on the light. My heart seized at the vision that greeted me. The silhouette was no longer near the refrigerator. It stood at the open oven, bathed in that same sinister red glow as if it were stepping out of a furnace. My breath stuttered, and I realized the oven door was ajar, the interior light flickering in an ominous way. The figure seemed larger now, its edges more defined in the unnatural light. My muscles locked and I couldn't move. A sudden wave of heat radiated from the oven, or at least I imagined it did, enough that my skin felt clammy and overheated. At once I recalled the dream of fire in the cafe, and for one delirious second I pictured my kitchen erupting in the same crimson flames. The silhouette raised an arm like a silent chef, beckoning me closer or offering some guidance. My stomach churned. I could hear my own pulse thudding in my ears. I tried to inhale but only managed shallow gasps. My throat constricted by an invisible pressure and a flash of clarity. I remembered that I had left some raw chicken in the fridge intending to cook a late lunch. Could the silhouette be pointing toward it? My thoughts spiraled and I felt unsteady on my feet. Still trembling, I approached the figure each step forward, made my chest tighten further, but something compelled me not to flee. The red glow flared momentarily as if acknowledging my presence. Then almost tenderly, the silhouette seemed to retreat into the oven, leaving the door open. I stood there uncertain whether to slam it shut or peer inside. My eyes stung from the dryness as if I had forgotten to blink for too long. The overhead fluorescent flickered again. The hum of electricity merged with my frenzied heartbeat, forming a crescendo of tension in my mind. I inched forward, swallowing hard, and reached for the oven door. My palms were slick with sweat, making my grip unsteady when I leaned in. It was just the interior of the oven, lit by a small bulb. There was no sign of the silhouette. The temperature inside was only mildly warm, as if I had preheated it earlier and forgot. My stomach lurched when I recalled I hadn't used the oven in days. I backed away, breath shuddering, and nearly tripped over the kitchen mat. Suddenly, the overhead light buzzed again, and everything seemed painfully bright and mundane, except for the stench of my own sweat and the frantic hammering of my heart. I told a close friend about these encounters in a hushed, indirect manner without revealing every uncanny detail. I admitted I kept seeing a figure in red, described how the fridge magnets fell, and how I felt compelled to visit a cafe at the exact time indicated on a mysterious receipt. They suggested I was suffering from stress-induced hallucinations. It was the most rational explanation, and yet a stubborn part of me refused to believe it was just in my head. For the next few weeks, I avoided the kitchen light after dark. I used a small desk lamp when I needed something from the fridge. If I had to cook, I did so at normal hours, always with the main lights on, music, playing anything to dispel the suffocating quiet. Still, there were moments when I sensed a presence behind me, a flash of crimson in my peripheral vision, or the subtle odor of smoke that dissipated before I could prove it was there. My paranoia skyrocketed. I began to suspect every hiss in the pipes as a harbinger of a gas leak. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected to encounter that shape waiting for me. My hands shook whenever I handled anything flammable, and I kept checking the stove burners, obsessively making sure none were leaking gas. My reflection in the mirror each morning looked gaunt. My eyes sunken with worry, I caught myself listening for that distant crackling sound I had imagined near the fridge, as though it might sneak up on me if I let my guard down. Finally, I resolved that if the red silhouette was some kind of warning or a spirit, perhaps I should face it again on my own terms. One late afternoon, I stood in my kitchen with the overhead light off, letting dusk shadows fill the small space. I set a pot of water on the stove and turned the burner on low. A faint hiss accompanied the blue flame. My heart pounded in my throat, but I forced myself to remain calm. The pot began to heat, steam curling in lazy tendrils. I kept glancing at the oven, half expecting the door to swing open as the evening deepened. The fluorescent light overhead flickered, then clicked on by itself with a harsh buzz. My breath caught the reflection in the stainless steel surface of the oven door, revealed that same faint shimmer of red thyme slowed. My arms prickled with goosebumps, and I felt the air press against my lungs like a lead weight. I fought the urge to switch the light off instead. I squared my shoulders and let the figure materialize in the reflection it seemed to occupy the space behind me. Bending at an angle as though peering over my shoulder, my hands shook violently. The pot on the stove began to boil water, sputtering over the edges and sizzling against the hot metal. I felt a sudden wave of panic, imagining scalding water splashing onto my skin. At the same time, I was seized by the fear of missing whatever the silhouette intended to communicate. The reflection's fiery glow intensified momentarily, and I had the strangest thought it looked almost protective, as though it wanted to help avert some disaster turning around. Slowly, I encountered empty space, yet my heartbeat refused to slow and my forehead was damp with sweat. I managed to switch off the burner, taking the pot away from the heat before it overflowed. The sense of relief lasted only a second. When I looked back at the oven, I found the door ajar again. I stepped toward it, breath quivering in my chest. Inside lay a single magnet from the fridge shaped like a tiny letter S placed on the middle rack. My head throbbed and the dryness in my mouth made it impossible to swallow. I couldn't imagine how it got there unless something or someone had placed it deliberately. I shut the oven door gently, feeling an undercurrent of unreality. My entire body trembled and a chill cascaded down my spine. Outside, the night was quiet, the world oblivious to the turmoil in my kitchen. No matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I knew there was something impossible happening here, an entity or force far beyond the scope of my everyday life. Lingering at the edge of my perception, it hadn't harmed me, but it had led me to the cafe, shown me glimpses of potential disaster, and now hovered in my home as if it were trying to guide me. I realized I was breathing in shallow gasps, the taste of copper strong on my tongue from gnawing the inside of my cheek. In fear, I wasn't sure if I was meant to be grateful or terrified, but I knew I wasn't ready to face a final confrontation. Each new manifestation felt like an escalation, pushing me further toward a cliff of understanding that I wasn't certain I wanted to reach. Maybe it was a warning system protecting me from accidents or tragedies yet to unfold. Maybe it was something else entirely playing with my mind as I flicked off the kitchen light for the night. The afterimage of that crimson shape lingered in my vision, leaving me on the threshold between fear and a twisted sense of comfort. Sleep, when it finally arrived, brought no real peace. I tossed and turned, half expecting the sound of crackling flames or the hiss of gas in the morning. The uneasy stillness in my apartment was almost more unnerving than the night had been. All I could do was carry on, uncertain when or if that red silhouette would appear again, but convinced it would never truly be gone. Even now that knowledge keeps me on edge, I continue to cook late at night, drawn to the solace of a quiet kitchen, even if it means confronting the disturbing presence that might be lurking there. My palms still get clammy when I reach for the light switch, yet there's a strange part of me that finds comfort in knowing I'm not entirely alone in those dark hours. The terror is real, and so is the possibility that this force, whatever it may be, could be trying to shield me from a fate I can only guess at. But the dread remains a constant pulse in the back of my mind. reminding me that the boundary between safety and chaos is disturbingly thin and easily crossed by something as simple as the flip of a switch story. 13, I still remember the exact moment I first laid eyes on those two Inca jars. They seemed inconspicuous among the dusty relics at the anthropological auction, yet they were the only items that felt unmistakably alive. There was an unsettling presence around them, a low hum nearly imperceptible like a distant wind, moaning across a canyon at dusk from the second they were placed on my fireplace mantel. My home felt changed, the air pressed in a little tighter. The shadows looked more angular, and a vague unease started to coil inside me. I had purchased them almost impulsively, swayed by the curator's stories of their supposed ceremonial significance. Supposedly, these jars were used by an ancient Andean culture to store offerings, gold dust, dried cocoa leaves, or even personal tokens given in exchange for blessings. My rational mind told me it was just folklore designed to drive up bids, but some part of me, perhaps that primal instinctual side, wasn't so sure. After all, the moment the hammer came down and the jars were officially mine, a jolt of nervous excitement shot through me as though I had just committed to something I didn't fully understand. I placed them on the mantel in my living room, facing each other like two silent sentinels. Their surfaces were rough clay etched with faint patterns reminiscent of mountain peaks and winding paths. The one on the left had a jagged imperfection near its base, almost like a crack that had been sealed ages ago. The one on the right displayed a faintly visible symbol, a serpentine line wrapping around the circumference. Neither jar was very large, perhaps the height of a standard coffee thermos. Nonetheless, they seemed heavy, as if carved from compacted earth rather than molded from fired clay. In the first week, I tried to ignore the feeling that they were watching me. I would wake up and walk into the living room, blinking the sleep from my eyes, only to sense a shift in the air. It felt as though someone had been whispering, and I had interrupted. My heart would pound a little harder at these moments, dismissing it as nonsense. I'd continue with my morning routine, but that tension under my skin never quite went away. It was a Monday afternoon when I first heard the jars make the sound. I was on a video call with a colleague discussing the logistics of working remotely indefinitely. Suddenly, a soft clicking reached my ears like nails tapping on thick glass. The noise was so faint I thought I was imagining it. Then it intensified, becoming a rapid snapping, as if the clay itself were fracturing from within. My pulse quickened, and I forced myself to keep a calm tone with my colleague, even though sweat prickled at my hairline. When I glanced toward the mantel, I saw no visible movement yet. The sound persisted for another agonizing few seconds, then abruptly stopped. A few days later, I declined a promotion offer from my supervisor via email. The workload was too high. I explained in my message, and the benefits weren't enticing enough to justify it. Moments after hitting send, I felt a stirring in the air. The living room lights flickered, the walls seemed to contract. A fine dust drifted through the space, swirling in miniature cyclones near the ceiling. Before settling onto the carpet, my eyes itched. My throat went dry, and my heart hammered in my chest as though warning me something was very wrong. I knelt down to examine the dust, only to notice tiny glinting specks mixed in small grains of what appeared to be gold. I began picking them up, my fingers trembling, and realized there were exactly as many grains as the dollar amount in the salary increase. I had just refused the next time I discussed remote work with a friend, casually mentioning my preference for flexible hours. I heard that same snapping from the jars, but this time I caught a faint moaning layered beneath it, as if distant voices were rising from the clay. It reminded me of an old documentary I once saw about mountain fighters in the Andes, their rhythmic chanting echoing off the ridges. My stomach churned, a metallic tang hovered in the room, reminiscent of oxidized copper. There was no rational explanation for this, and that was what frightened me the most. I started to avoid talking about anything related to my job at home. My living room, a place that was once my refuge, became a stifling stage for bizarre phenomena each time I so much as thought about job offers or remote setups. The hairs on my arms would stand on end, my breathing grew shallow, and I'd watch the fireplace out of the corner of my eye, bracing myself for more snaps, moans, or swirling dust at night. I would often dream of climbing steep mountain passes, weighed down by an invisible force. In these dreams, I carried a small pouch of gold dust that spilled whenever I took a wrong step. Figures in elaborate headdresses marched beside me, chanting in low, haunting tones. Their faces were obscured, but their voices reverberated. Resonating with my own panic, I would wake up drenched in sweat, heart galloping in my chest, the taste of copper clinging to the back of my throat as if I had been breathing in metal fumes all night. The tension escalated noticeably. One morning, after finishing a simple phone call about scheduling a meeting at the office, I entered the living room and immediately sensed the air was different. It had a density that made me feel like I was stepping into a chamber sealed for centuries. My lungs struggled to draw breath, and a chill crept along my arms as my gaze landed on the jars. I noticed something off about the left one. It was angled slightly toward me, though I could have sworn I had left it facing forward. I approached carefully, my hands cold and clammy. The jar's opening now pointed in my direction as though challenging me to peer inside. I didn't dare look too long. My mind told me I was being superstitious, that clay jars couldn't move on their own. But my gut, tied in knots, insisted something else was happening when I reached out to rotate the jar back. My fingers brushed against its rough surface and a tingling sensation shot up my arm. It felt like static shock, but colder. My entire body tensed and I reeled back, nearly losing my balance. I left the jar as it was and rushed out of the house, locking the door behind me with shaky hands. That evening I returned home to find a scattering of gold dust on the coffee table, enough to form a thin layer that spelled out a number in faint lines. The number matched the new promotion package that Human Resources had emailed me that afternoon. My vision blurred and my throat constricted. Forcing me to gulp for air with trembling fingers, I tried to wipe the dust away, but it clung to my skin. I rubbed my palms together, but the gold wouldn't fully come off, leaving a shimmering residue that sparkled under the overhead light. I felt nauseated, both disgusted and hypnotized by this eerie spectacle. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of every subtle shift in my home's atmosphere. Every time I walked into the living room, my skin prickled as though unseen eyes were tracking my every move. My nights grew restless, plagued by more elaborate visions of mountainous terrain and ghostly Inca processions. Sometimes I could almost smell the cold altitude air mingling with that ever-present hint of copper. I considered throwing the jars out or locking them in storage, but some gnawing dread stopped me. It felt like I would be tampering with a force that demanded respect or at least caution. Instead, I tried to ignore them. I stopped discussing anything job-related at home. I also began to accept more tasks and promotions just to see if that would stave off the dust storms. Yet the phenomena continued, though in smaller, almost mocking increments. I would wait to find a single golden grain in front of my bedroom door or hear the faint rattle of clay shifting late at night. Then on a particularly cold and drizzly evening, something happened that shattered whatever illusion of control I still clung to. I was returning from the kitchen with a glass of water, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. The living room was dark, save for the glow from a street lamp outside. As I turned on a side table lamp, I froze. The left jar had rotated a full 180 degrees from its usual position. My pulse skyrocketed and my breath came in ragged bursts. The jar's mouth no longer faced the fireplace. It pointed straight into the room, mustering the courage to approach. I found that its interior looked different. At first, it seemed like an endless shadow, but as I leaned closer, I saw faint shapes inside the jar. There was a swirling darkness that gradually cleared, revealing something that made my heart clench, a miniature version of my own office. I recognized the desk, the chair, even the little lamp I kept on the side. At that moment, my palms grew sweaty and a tremor rippled through my arms. I wanted to convince myself it was just my overworked mind playing tricks, but the details were too precise to dismiss. Then I saw movement within that tiny office scene, a small clay figure hunched over the desk, tapping away at a microscopic keyboard. It moved with a jerky mechanical quality, as if propelled by some ancient force. I could almost hear the echo of keys clicking, though the jar's interior remained silent. The figure's posture was painfully familiar. It mimicked the way I leaned in my chair, especially when I was neck deep in spreadsheets and reports. My stomach knotted and my throat felt too tight to swallow. I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears, and shut off the lamp darkness. Overtook the living room, but I could still sense the jar's presence. I found it impossible to sleep that night. Instead, I sat upright in bed, my breath shallow. My mind spinning with horrifying questions. Was the figure in the jar an echo of me bound to work endlessly like some damned soul? Or did it represent an alternate version of my life? One enslaved by the demands of corporate obligations I kept trying to dodge? Over the next several days, every time I passed the mantel, I noticed that the jar remained turned. I couldn't bear to look inside again. I felt the phantom weight of it on my consciousness, a constant presence that eroded my peace of mind at work. I was jumpy, double-checking doorways and mirrors, half expecting to see that clay figure lurking somewhere behind me. My nerves were shot, my skin was always clammy, and I started getting pounding headaches that pulsed in my temples. Even coffee lost its taste, replaced by an odd metallic bitterness on my tongue. The final, most harrowing moment came one night when I tried to confront the jar directly. I walked into the living room feeling my heart thud like a drum in my chest, and approached the mantel with determined steps. A single overhead light cast jagged shadows across the walls, giving the impression that the jars were enormous. Reaching far above me in elongated shapes, my hands shook so hard I nearly dropped the flashlight I carried. I aimed the light into the dark opening of the left jar, expecting to see that miniature office again. But at first I saw only pitch black emptiness. The air around me turned colder, and a faint rasping breeze seemed to emanate from the jar's mouth. Making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, I forced myself to look deeper, my breath catching in my throat gradually as scene began to coalesce. It was the same tiny office, but unlit, strewn with papers, as if some frenzy of work had left the place in disarray. The clay figure was still there, hunched at the desk, tapping away. This time, though, it was turned slightly to the side, as if aware it was being watched. A flickering suspicion crawled through my mind. Was that figure larger now? It seemed more defined with finer details. Where before it had been a crude shape, its clay arms moved in a disturbingly realistic motion, each finger pressing down keys that seemed to produce no sound but carried an uncanny weight in my chest. My breath came in short gasps and I felt lightheaded. Everything in me wanted to run, but I stood frozen, transfixed by the impossibility unfolding right in front of my eyes. Then the clay figure paused slowly. It swiveled in its tiny chair, turning toward me. I couldn't see a face, only a smooth, shapeless protrusion, but I sensed it was looking at me. My entire body tensed, my lips parted in a silent scream as a wave of cold dread washed over me. I stumbled backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Darkness rushed in as if the shadows themselves lunged forward to swallow me all at once. The living room felt suffocating. My lungs fought for air, and my throat burned with each swallow. I managed to pick up the flashlight, though my fingers were numb and stiff, without wasting another second. I sprinted out of the room, flicking on every light switch along the way. My chest heaved and my heart pounded so forcefully that I worried it might give out. I ended up on my porch, breathing in the cold night air, eyes brimming with tears of raw terror and relief. As I stood there trembling, I felt an unshakable certainty that I could no longer live under the same roof as those jars. It wasn't just a matter of disposing of them. There was something binding me to their bizarre, otherworldly pull, something that wouldn't simply vanish. If I tossed them in a landfill, my life had already intertwined with their silent demands and horrific illusions. I suspected that if I stayed, I'd eventually find myself pulled deeper into that miniature world, locked in perpetual labor at a ghostly desk. Just like that clay figure, I made a spur-of-the-moment decision to escape. I packed a single suitcase, grabbed my essentials, and left the house, leaving the jars behind on the mantel the entire time. My heart raced and my forehead broke out in a cold sweat. My mouth felt parched and my hands trembled uncontrollably. Every footstep toward the door felt heavier as though invisible hands tugged at my ankles, but I kept moving in my rearview mirror. The house stood dark against the cloudy sky, its windows reflecting a dull, lifeless stare. I drove away, trying not to think about the snapping sounds or the dust that had once coated my carpet. I can't say I've left the fear behind entirely. Even now, the memory of those jars gnaws at my sanity on occasion. I wake in the middle of the night, certain I hear the faint crackle of clay shifting, or the echo of distant chanting in the wind outside. Sometimes an inexplicable metallic tang fills my mouth, and I'm hurled back into that suffocating dread, half expecting to see gold dust forming cryptic numbers on my floor. The terror is a stain on my psyche that no amount of distance seems to erase, and whenever I glance at my laptop or think about the promotions and remote opportunities I once considered, I feel a chill sweep over me as though the jars have found a new place to lurk in my own reflection, waiting to remind me that some deals once made can never be fully undone,